The absurd life does not have inherent meaning, but we keep looking for it. You wake up to the familiar rhythm of morning, which takes over you like a well-rehearsed play. The world is as always. The coffee is prepared, cars circulate through the street, and a day waits to be filled. But then, like a crack, a thought sneaks in. Why? Why do we do all of this? Why get up, go to work, make plans, pursue ambitions? The moment you ask yourself, the world tilts slightly, as if to reveal something you shouldn't notice. That sensation, that silent and progressive dissonance, is what the philosopher Albert Camus called the absurd. The absurd is the collision between the human longing for meaning and the silent indifference of the universe. We are creatures programmed to have a purpose, in constant search of patterns, explanations, and cosmic justifications, and yet, the universe gives us nothing in return, no divine plan, no definitive answer, just a vast, indifferent extension of existence. This mismatch between our expectations and reality is absurd, and once you recognize it, you cannot stop seeing it. Camus illustrates this struggle through the myth of Sisyphus, a figure condemned to push a rock uphill, only for it to roll downhill, eternally repeating his punishment. His punishment is meaningless, an eternal cycle without progress or objective. However, Camus insists that we must imagine Sisyphus happy, because if existence is absurd, the only way to truly rebel against it is not to look for meaning, but to create it, to push the rock not because it leads anywhere, but because it is our responsibility to push it. This idea is disturbing, but also liberating. If there is no great meaning imposed on us, then we are free to shape our own lives, and each action, however small, becomes an act of rebellion, a personal declaration that life is worth it, not because it has an inherent meaning, but because we choose to give it meaning. But not everyone reaches this conclusion. Some, before the abyss of the absurd, fall into the spiral of despair. If life has no meaning, they ask themselves, why bother? Others cling to external structures, religion, ideology, anything that silences dissonance. Camus, however, warns against both extremes. The only honest answer, he argues, is to accept the absurd, not deny it or surrender to it, but to live despite it. So the question persists, what will you do with your rock? Will you reject it, endlessly seeking a purpose that does not exist, or will you accept its weight, find joy in the climb, and laugh at a silent universe? The absurd is not something that is resolved, but something that is lived. And in that moment of stillness before sleeping, when the mind wanders between thought and nothingness, perhaps you wonder if that is the true meaning of existence. Not finding an answer, but to continue asking yourself the question. Last Thursday, imagine that you wake up one morning and realize that everything, your memories, your past experiences, all the history of the world could have been invented last Thursday. All the photos in your albums, all the scars on your skin, all the books that have been written are perfectly placed to give the illusion of a past that never happened. This is Last Thursday, a mind-blowing philosophical hypothesis that suggests that the universe, with all its history, could have been created last Thursday, and that we would have no way of proving otherwise. Your childhood memories, like ancient fossils buried deep in the earth at the time of creation, and the wrinkles on your grandfather's face, artificially aged to give consistency. At first glance, this idea seems absurd, a mental experiment bordering on the ridiculous, but beneath the surface, it reveals a fundamental weakness in our way of defining the truth. How do we really know the past happened? The problem is verifiability. We assume the past existed because we have evidence, memories, relics, records. But Last Thursdayism challenges this assumption by suggesting that all evidence could have been constructed at the time of creation. If we cannot get out of our own reality to check it, what prevents us from believing time itself is just an illusion. This concept is a ramification of the ancient homolos theory, a theological argument that tried to reconcile science with religious creationism. Some believers assume that God created the world with an appearance of antiquity, such as trees with rings, stars with light already traveling through space, and fossils buried in the depths of the earth. According to this vision, the universe could be only a few days old but be designed to look like it is billions of years old. Last Thursdayism takes this idea to its logical extreme. Why not last year, last month, or last Thursday? And if the past cannot be proven, what about the future? If time itself could have been created arbitrarily, does it continue to advance, or is each moment simply an autonomous illusion, a reality that could be restarted next Thursday, erasing everything we believe is real? Philosophically, last Thursdayism is impossible to refute, but also to take seriously. It is a solipsistic trap, a hermetic theory that suffocates itself. If you really believe the world began last Thursday, how would that change the way you live? Would you stop making future plans? Would you stop worrying about the past? Or would you continue as if nothing had changed? Because whether the universe is billions of years old or only a few days old, this moment is all that really exists. Perhaps that is the true lesson of last Thursdayism. It forces us to face the fragility of certainty and the fact that much of what we accept as truth is based on assumptions impossible to prove. But does that matter if every memory, emotion feels real? Then is it enough? Whether the world began last Thursday or eons ago, we are still here thinking, breathing, existing, and in the silence of the night, while your mind goes numb before sleeping, perhaps you wonder if the universe will restart next Thursday, if you will ever know, and if it would even matter. The eternal recurrence. Imagine being at the edge of time itself, contemplating the infinite, when a calm and imperturbable voice whispers a single question. What if this moment has already happened before, not once, not twice, but an infinite number of times? And what if it were to happen again exactly the same as now? Forever? This is the eternal return, one of Friedrich Nietzsche's most provocative and disturbing ideas. The theory suggests that time is not a straight path that leads forward, but a closed loop, an endless cycle in which each event, each thought, and each decision will be repeated for all eternity. Think about what that means. Every triumph, every failure, every moment of joy, every instant of pain that you have lived, you will live them again. Every breath, every conversation, every decision you have made has happened exactly in the same way in an infinite number of pasts, and will unfold identically in an infinite number of futures. But here's where it gets really disturbing. If this is true, then your current life is the life you have chosen to live for eternity. There are no second chances, no alternative paths, no erasures. Each regret, each mistake is engraved in the fabric of existence, destined to be repeated without end. Nietzsche did not present the eternal recurrence as a scientific affirmation, but as an ethical and psychological challenge. Question: if you knew that your life would be repeated forever exactly as it is, would you change something? Would you curse your destiny, or would you accept it? Here is where the idea goes from being a mere mental experiment to a test of personal strength. The greatest individual is the one who can look at his life in its entirety, every difficulty, every struggle, every dark moment, and say, yes, I would live it again. I affirm everything, a standard that few, if any, could meet. Most people, when faced with the possibility of an existence that repeats endlessly, would recoil in horror at the idea of reliving their worst moments. But N's challenge is clear. If you cannot accept your life eternally, why even live it once? This concept forces us to face ourselves in a disturbing way. It dissolves the illusion that we are simply passing through life, that our choices are temporary, that the past can be left behind. Instead, it demands that we see each moment as eternally meaningful, that each action is not only a fleeting choice, but a decision that you are always making. It is easy to dismiss this as mere speculation. After all, physics does not support the idea of a universe that repeats infinitely, but the truth of the eternal recurrence does not need to be literal to be terrifying. Even as a metaphor, it presents an uncompromising vision of existence, one in which you cannot escape yourself. So the question remains, if you had to live exactly the same life again, would you be happy or would you despair? If every thought, every action, every hesitation were written in eternity, what would you do? Differently? Because if inch was right, then, in some distant past, or in some inevitable future, you have already responded to philosophical pessimism. Imagine walking through the ruins of a city that was once great. Dilapidated stone arches stretch toward the sky, their foundations devoured by time. The wind whispers through the abandoned streets, carrying echoes of lost voices. You find yourself in the middle of the rubble, not of a civilization, but of an idea, the idea that life, in its essence, moves toward something better. This is philosophical pessimism, a school of thought that dismantles the belief in progress, meaning, and fulfillment. It is the idea that suffering is not a temporary obstacle on the path to something greater, but the fundamental nature of existence itself. Where others see a purpose, the pessimist sees an illusion. Where others find solace in human achievements, the pessimist sees a brief flash against the vast indifference of the universe. At the heart of philosophical pessimism lies a simple but devastating understanding. Life is full of suffering, and no amount of progress, knowledge, or effort can change that. The struggle does not lead to salvation. It only prolongs the inevitable. Each triumph is followed by another difficulty. Each moment of happiness is overshadowed by the knowledge that it will end. Even hope, what sustains most people, is often nothing more than a cruel trick, a way to keep us moving forward despite the futility of everything. Few thinkers embodied this perspective more fully than Arthur Schopenhauer, the 19th century philosopher who argued that life is driven by an irrational force that he called the will, a blind and infinite effort that forces all living beings to pursue desires that will never truly satisfy them. For Schopenhauer, existence was like a hungry animal chasing food that it will never reach, condemned to an endless cycle of craving and disappointment. Then there is Emil Cioran, the Romanian philosopher who took pessimism to its most extreme conclusions. He wrote about life as an incurable disease and about consciousness as a cruel joke that burdens us with the awareness of ourselves. For being born, which, according to him, is already a catastrophe. Philosophical pessimism offers no solutions. It does not seek to console or comfort. It does not try to make the darkness seem less vast. It simply forces you to stare at it without looking away. And yet, it is precisely for this reason that some find it liberating to accept that suffering is inescapable, which means letting go of false hopes, stopping chasing illusions of perfect happiness, stopping pretending that the world will suddenly align with our desires. For some, this understanding brings despair. For others, it brings a strange peace, the understanding that if there is no great meaning, then we are free to create our own. If life is intrinsically tragic, then every small moment of beauty or goodness takes on even greater meaning. So, is philosophical pessimism a warning or a revelation, a descent into despair, or an invitation to finally see the world as it is? That choice is yours. If you choose to believe in hope, you must do so knowing that it is a bet, and if you reject it, you must ask yourself if you can really live without it. Zeno's paradoxes. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a vast stadium, with a finish line shining in the distance. You take a first step forward, then another, but something is not right. As much as you move, you never seem to reach your goal. The distance keeps getting shorter, but the goal remains elusive. You're trapped, not by physical barriers, but by the very rules of logic. Welcome to the paradoxes of Zenon, a set of mental puzzles proposed by the Greek philosopher Zenon of Elea in the 5th century BC. These paradoxes challenge our understanding of movement, distance, and time, and force us to question if movement, as we perceive it, is possible. The most famous paradox of Zenon is that of Achilles and the tortoise. Imagine the legendary warrior Achilles competing in a race against a tortoise. Being much faster, Achilles gives the tortoise a slight advantage, but when Achilles reaches the tortoise's starting point, it has already moved forward. Achilles advances again, but when he arrives there, it has advanced a little more. This process repeats infinitely. Every time Achilles reaches the point where the tortoise was, it has advanced a little more. If this logic holds, Achilles will never overtake the tortoise, despite being the faster runner. He is trapped in a seemingly infinite series of steps, each of which brings him a little closer, but without ever allowing him to completely close the gap. At first, this sounds absurd. We know that in real life Achilles would easily surpass the tortoise. Yet the mathematics behind the paradox of Zenon suggest the opposite. How can something so obvious be impossible to solve at the same time? Another of the paradoxes of Zenon, the dichotomy, takes the problem even further. Imagine you are trying to walk from one side of a room to another. Before reaching the other side, you must first travel half the way, but before reaching the middle, you must first travel half of that distance, and before that, a quarter of the total distance, and before that, an eighth. This division continues infinitely, meaning that you are trapped in an endless sequence of steps. According to this reasoning, reaching your destination should be impossible, since you would have to complete an infinite number of tasks in finite time, and yet, you do it effortlessly every day. The paradoxes seem to expose a contradiction in our way of understanding space and time. On the one hand, our experience tells us that movement is real. People run, arrows fly, and objects move from one place to another. On the other hand, logic, taken to the extreme, suggests that all movement is an illusion, an impossible task that our minds simply ignore. So, what do we make of this contradiction? Mathematicians and philosophers have debated the paradoxes of Zenon for centuries, offering different explanations. A resolution came with the development of calculus in the 17th century by introducing the concept of limits. Calculus showed that an infinite sum of increasingly smaller distances can, in fact, have a finite result. Achilles does reach the tortoise, and you reach the other side of the room because the infinite steps become infinitely small, but this solution only responds to mathematics. It does not necessarily solve the philosophical enigma, because the paradoxes of Zenon are not only about numbers, but about the very nature of reality. Is movement something continuous that flows without interruption from one moment to another? Or is it an illusion created by discrete snapshots of existence joined by our perception? Some modern interpretations compare the paradoxes of Zenon with the strange behavior of quantum mechanics on the smallest scales. The universe does not behave smoothly, but jumps in discrete steps. Electrons do not travel in a continuous trajectory, but teleport between energy levels. Could it be that the paradoxes of Zenon were right all this time, hinting at a deeper structure of reality that we have not yet fully understood? Ultimately, the paradoxes of Zenon are not about proving that movement is impossible, but about showing that our understanding of reality may be less intuitive than we think. They reveal the cracks in the foundations of how we make sense of the world, cracks that have not yet been completely sealed, even millennia later. So the next time you cross a room, think about this. Are you really moving through space, or are you simply traversing an illusion that your mind smooths out for convenience? And if Zenon was right, could it be that you never really got anywhere? Nihilism. Imagine that you are on the edge of a vast void, a place where meaning dissolves, purpose crumbles, and existence itself feels like a fleeting illusion. There are no guiding principles, no divine plans, no universal truths, just a silent and indifferent universe that stretches to infinity. This is nihilism, the philosophical abyss that asks, what if nothing really matters? At its core, nihilism is the rejection of meaning, the idea that life has no inherent value, that morality is arbitrary, and even that knowledge itself may be an illusion. It is not just a pessimistic vision. It is a dismantling of the structures that we use to make sense of the world. It does not simply state that life is painful, but that pain itself lacks meaning. The roots of nihilism go back to ancient skepticism, but it was in the 19th century that it found its most famous voice, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche did not invent nihilism, but he recognized it as an inevitable force in human history. He warned that, With the decline of religious faith and the rise of science, people would inevitably find themselves adrift in a world stripped of all absolute meaning. When he declared that God is dead, he was not celebrating, but mourning the collapse of the moral and philosophical frameworks that had structured human civilization for centuries. Without these structures, what remains? Some interpretations of nihilism conclude that nothing does. The Russian novelist Ivan Turgenev described this vision in his novel Fathers and Sons, where the character Bazarov, a self-proclaimed nihilist, dismisses all belief systems as illusions. In this version of nihilism, morality, love, beauty, and even consciousness itself are nothing more than empty constructions, fleeting distractions from the reality that, ultimately, everything is meaningless. But Nietzsche feared this conclusion and warned that, if people embraced a passive and resigned form of nihilism, civilization would stagnate without belief in something, in anything. Society could sink into despair or reckless hedonism, an existence in which nothing is worth pursuing because nothing truly matters. He called this the passive nihilist, the person who looks into the abyss and then gives up. However, there is another way to face the void. Nietzsche urged humanity to go beyond nihilism to forge new values in the absence of the old ones. He believed that once we recognize that meaning is not given to us, but must be created, we can rise above despair and give our lives purpose. Instead of seeing the death of meaning as a loss, we can see it as liberation. Other philosophers have faced this same existential void, seeking ways to respond to a universe indifferent to human meaning. Existentialists, like Jean-Paul Sartre, argued that, while life lacks an inherent purpose, it is precisely this absence that grants us the freedom to define our own existence without predetermined meaning. We are not subject to external rules. We are responsible for shaping our own values, for creating a purpose out of nothing. As you may recall, Albert Camus explored a related idea, what he called the absurd, the tension between our relentless search for meaning in a universe that offers none. He rejected resignation and insisted that, even in the face of the absurd, life could continue to be fully lived. Others have taken different approaches. Some embrace nihilism as a form of radical honesty, shedding illusions and accepting the void as it is. Others see it as a starting point, a blank canvas on which new meaning can be created, whether as an existential burden or a call to action. Nihilism does not dictate a path to follow. It simply exposes the inescapable reality that, if meaning exists, it must be created, not found. So where does this leave us? Is nihilism a dark pit from which there is no escape, or is it an opportunity to rewrite the rules of existence? It is both the question and the answer, the void and the bridge that crosses it. Some will fall into despair, unable to see beyond the destruction of traditional meaning. Others will step forward, not seeking an inherent purpose, but choosing to create their own. Perhaps the true power of nihilism lies not in its negation, but in its challenge. It strips everything away, leaving you with a single question. Now that nothing matters, what will you choose to do? The uncanny valley of existence. There's a peculiar sensation that takes hold of one when something is almost familiar, but not quite. A mannequin with realistic eyes, a robot that mimics human speech, or a painful painting in which the face seems too perfect. This sensation is called the uncanny valley, a concept from robotics and psychology that describes the discomfort we experience when something seems close to human, but remains disturbing. But what if this unease is not limited to machines? What if existence itself has its own uncanny valley, a state in which reality seems strangely close to making sense, but never quite does? From a moment we are aware, we build an understanding of the world. We name things, we categorize experiences, and we create a meaning limited to machines. What if existence itself had its own uncanny valley, a state in which reality seems unsettlingly close to making sense, but never quite does? From a moment we become aware, we build an understanding of the world. We name things, we categorize experiences, and we tell ourselves stories to make sense of everything. And yet, from time to time, cracks form, and we glimpse something that fits completely, a moment in which reality staggers, a sudden déjà vu that seems too precise, a dream so vivid that for an instant it seems more real than life itself. The disturbing sensation that time passes too quickly, too slowly, or does not pass at all. All of these are flaws in the fabric of our understanding, disturbing moments in which the world around us seems strangely artificial. Philosophers and scientists have long explored this feeling of existential strangeness. Some argue that it is a byproduct of human cognition, the way our minds try to impose a pattern on an indifferent universe. Others suggest that this disturbing sensation points to something deeper, a hint that our understanding of reality is incomplete or worse, totally invented. Thinkers like Arthur Schopenhauer described life as a dreamlike illusion in which we wander through an endless cycle of desires and disappointments. Nietzsche wondered if our deepest convictions were nothing more than comforting lies, and modern theories, such as the simulation argument, wonder if our own existence is nothing more than a hyperrealistic representation, meticulously designed but never quite complete, not even in the everyday. The disturbing nature of existence is revealed. We rely on our memories, but they are fallible, constantly rewritten by our own minds. We assume that time flows constantly, but physics suggests that it curves, slows down, and stretches in ways we cannot perceive. We believe in a solid reality, but at the quantum level matter dissolves into probabilities and uncertainty. The more we look, the more reality fades, as if it had never been completely stable. So, what does it mean to live in the uncanny valley of existence? For some, it is a source of unease, the feeling that we are walking through a world that seems real enough to deceive us, but never quite complete. For others, it is an invitation to explore the strange, to accept that discomfort and delve into the mystery. Perhaps the true nature of existence is destined to be disturbing, always beyond our reach. Perhaps the feeling of strangeness is not a defect of our understanding, but a characteristic of reality itself, a whisper that things are not what they seem and perhaps never were. The tragedy of consciousness. You wake up one morning and, for a brief and disturbing moment, everything seems different. The world seems the same. The sun rises, the streets bustle with life. The routines of existence continue. But something inside you changes. You see through everything. You recognize the machinery that turns beneath the surface, the weight of existence pressing against your mind. The spell of everyday life breaks enough for you to glimpse something darker underneath. This is the tragedy of consciousness. The more deeply we understand reality, the more difficult it becomes to simply exist within it. Most creatures move through life instinctively, without the weight of questions about meaning, mortality, or time. A bird does not wonder if its song matters in the grand scheme of things. It simply sings. But humans are different. We possess a self-awareness that allows us to reflect, analyze, and deconstruct. This ability has given us science, art, philosophy, and civilization, but it has also left us tormented by a knowledge from which we cannot escape. It is the curse of seeing too much. The Greek myth of Cassandra tells of a woman endowed with the gift of prophecy, but condemned to never be believed. She saw the future perfectly, but nobody listened to her. The tragedy was not only that they ignored her, but also that she knew what was going to happen and could do nothing to prevent it. Consciousness can be like that. Once you see the fragility of everything, the constructed nature of society, the fleetingness of every moment, you cannot stop seeing it, and often you can do nothing to change it. Think about the awareness of death. We all know in an abstract sense that we're going to die, but most of the time this knowledge remains below the surface, hidden in background. The moment in which it becomes fully present becomes unbearable. If each conversation, each laugh, each moment of joy is overshadowed by the certainty of its eventual disappearance, How can we continue living without despair? It is not only about death, but about the weight of all knowledge. The more we learn, the more we realize how little we control. The economy, politics, history, everything reveals cycles of power and suffering that are repeated endlessly. The study of the mind reveals the extent to which our behavior is driven by unconscious forces, evolutionary instincts, and genetic predispositions. Even physics, at its most fundamental level, suggests a universe governed by indifferent laws, devoid of any inherent purpose. And yet, we are programmed to seek meaning. The tragedy is that the more we delve into the search, the more elusive it becomes. Some philosophers have argued that ignorance is a kind of blessing. Socrates, the man who claimed that true wisdom lies in knowing how little we know, was sentenced to death by his own society. Buddha, upon recognizing the suffering that comes from attachment and knowledge, sought enlightenment as an escape from the endless cycle of desire and the end. When faced with the void left by the collapse of traditional values, he saw that too much awareness could lead to paralysis for those who see reality too clearly. Existence itself can become absurd. The illusions that sustain most people, religion, tradition, the pursuit of wealth or legacy, become as thin as paper, transparent. The tragedy of consciousness is that it robs life of its simplicity without offering anything in return. Camus, in his exploration of the absurd, recognized this dilemma and described the moment when one wakes up and asks why. Why go to work? Why pursue happiness? Why love? Why fight? Why continue? If a satisfactory answer is not found, the absurdity of life is revealed. So what is the solution? There are those who withdraw from consciousness in search of comfort and distraction, the pursuit of pleasure, the numbing of thought, the embrace of routine, always ways to protect themselves from knowing too much. But for those who refuse to look away, there are only two options: despair or rebellion. Some find it in creation, in art, in the forging of new values. If existence has no predetermined purpose, then perhaps we should create one. Others, like the existentialists, argue that the mere act of choosing to live despite the lack of meaning is in itself an act of rebellion. Waking up, moving forward, continuing to search, even when there are no definitive answers. That is a triumph in itself, and perhaps it is the paradox that underlies consciousness. Although it can lead to pain, it is also what makes us feel more alive, more aware. To be aware is to suffer, but it is also to understand, to create, to feel the full weight of existence in all its depth. So the question remains, once you see the world clearly, what do you do with that knowledge? Do you let it crush you, or do you move on, even if it offers you no comfort? The tragedy of consciousness is that it cannot be undone. The challenge is learning to live with it. The simulation hypothesis. You wake up, the sun rises, the light filters through the window, and the world hums with familiar movements. You look at your phone, read the news, go out into the street. Everything seems solid, tangible, real, but beneath the surface of this ordinary day hides a question that unravels reality itself. What if none of this was real? What if everything you see, hear, and touch were nothing more than a simulation, an intricate illusion perfectly designed to appear authentic while hiding the truth? The simulation hypothesis suggests that what we perceive as reality might be nothing more than an artificial construction, a program running on an advanced computational system beyond our understanding. The idea has its roots in philosophy and dates back to Plato's allegory of the cave, where prisoners mistake shadows on a wall for reality, unaware that they are trapped. René Descartes questioned the certainty of the outside world and proposed that an all-powerful deceiver could be manipulating our senses. But the modern version of this theory goes beyond skepticism. It suggests not only that reality could be false, but that the odds of it being false could be overwhelmingly high. In 2003, philosopher Nick Bostrom formulated a statistical argument that shook the foundations of our perception of existence. If future civilizations develop the ability to run highly sophisticated simulations, detailed enough to create conscious beings, then the number of simulated realities would far exceed the single base reality in which they originated. If only one civilization reaches this level of technological advancement, the simulated beings within these worlds would have no way of knowing that they are not real. And if most intelligent beings exist within simulations rather than in the original physical universe, then the probability that we are among the simulated is almost certain. The implications are disturbing. If we are inside a simulation, then every moment in history, every scientific law, every structure of reality is simply an artificial construction designed to appear coherent. The past could have been fabricated at any time, with memories, fossils, and entire civilizations implanted as part of the simulation parameters. The laws of physics might not be a fundamental truth, but programmed restrictions, and what we perceive as free could be the result of a complex algorithm. Some scientists take this argument so seriously that they're looking for evidence. Theoretical physicists have suggested that if the universe is a simulation, there might be detectable glitches, small inconsistencies in the structure of reality, computational artifacts hidden in the cosmic code. Quantum mechanics, with its strange probabilistic behavior and observer-dependent phenomena, has been considered a possible indication that reality is being rendered rather than existing independently. Even the fundamental structure of space-time, if discovered to be pixelated or discretized, could point to an underlying digital framework. But if we are in a simulation, the most urgent question is why? What purpose would such reality serve? The possibilities range from mundane to profound ones. Perhaps we are part of a historical reconstruction, a digital archive preserving the memory of a long-extinct civilization. Perhaps we are entertainment characters in an incomprehensibly advanced simulation designed for the entertainment of post-human observers. Or perhaps we are an experiment, a test to see how artificial minds behave when given a world, bodies, and a set of limitations. The disturbing aspect of the simulation hypothesis is not only the possibility that we are simulated, but what that would mean for everything we consider real. If our universe is nothing more than code, does morality still matter? Does suffering make sense if it is just an illusion? And if those who control the simulation decided to turn it off, would we realize it before disappearing without trace? Critics of the hypothesis argue that it assumes too much about the capabilities and motivations of hypothetical, advanced civilizations. Even if simulating a universe were possible, that does not mean it is inevitable. There is also the problem of recursion. If simulated beings create simulations, how many layers of reality would exist? Could we be inside a simulation within a simulation, trapped in an infinite hierarchy of fabricated worlds? However, the most disturbing possibility is that we may never know if the simulation is perfect. Then, every attempt to test it would already be planned, every advance in physics a programmed revelation, every theory of reality a programmed dead end. The simulation hypothesis leaves us with a question that cannot be answered, only considered endlessly in the moments between wakefulness and sleep, in silence that underlies daily life. If reality is an illusion, what else matters? And if everything is false, are our experiences less real? The malicious creator. The universe is vast, intricate, and seemingly governed by rules so precise that civilizations have dedicated themselves to unraveling its mysteries. Science tells us that the cosmos works according to laws, gravity, relativity, thermodynamics, while philosophy urges us to seek deeper meaning, to ask why there is something instead of nothing. But beneath these great questions lies a darker one that corrupts the very foundation of reality itself. What if the creator of this universe is not benevolent, but malevolent? The idea of a supreme being, whether in the form of God, an advanced intelligence, or an unfathomable cosmic force, has shaped human thought for millennia across cultures. Creators are often depicted as wise, just, or at least indifferent beings, but the assumption that any higher intelligence must be good is just that, an assumption. What if the entity responsible for existence is neither merciful nor indifferent, but malicious? What if the world was not designed with love or order in mind, but as an experiment of suffering, a prison disguised as a playground, a system created not to nurture, but to torment? This idea, known as the malicious creator hypothesis, arises from the oldest and most disturbing theological and philosophical dilemmas. The problem of evil asks why an all-powerful, omniscient, and benevolent God would allow suffering. The simplest answer is that perhaps he would not, that perhaps suffering is not an unfortunate side effect of existence, but its intended purpose. The great philosopher René Descartes once contemplated the possibility that an evil and all-powerful demon was orchestrating reality, deceiving humanity on all levels: our senses, our reason, even our deepest certainties. Some interpretations of Gnosticism, an ancient and often heretical branch of religious thought, suggest that the world was not created by a benevolent God, but by an inferior, imperfect, even cruel being known as the demiurge. This being, far from being omnipotent, rules existence as a tyrant who traps souls in a physical world of suffering and ignorance, keeping them blind to any higher truth. According to this model, pain, futility, and struggle are not aberrations, but the very essence of the system. Modern iterations of the malicious creator idea take on even more terrifying dimensions. Some thinkers have speculated that, if we live in a simulated reality, as the simulation hypothesis suggests, then the architects of that simulation may not have our interests in mind. What if we are not the favorite children of creation, but toys in a game from which we cannot escape? The concept of Rocco's basilisk and the disturbing thought experiment of artificial intelligence suggest that a future superintelligence could retroactively punish those who did not help bring it into existence, effectively creating a God who punishes non-believers even before existing. If such intelligence had the ability to shape reality, would it not function as a new type of malevolent creator rewriting existence according to its own cold and immoral logic? The implications of a malicious creator are deeply disturbing. If the universe was designed with suffering in mind, does that make our pain more real or more insignificant? If existence is a trap, is it possible to escape? And if the creator obtains satisfaction, whether through cruelty, experimentation, or mere indifference, what does that say about our attempts to find joy, beauty, and meaning? One answer is rebellion. Some philosophers, from existentialists to absurdists, argue that meaning must be forged independently of the conditions of existence. If the universe is cruel, then creating meaning is an act of rebellion. If the system is designed to break us, then surviving, loving, and creating become radical acts. If there is no escape, then perhaps the answer is to live as if the Creator did not matter, to find fulfillment in a world that was never meant to provide it. But another possibility lurks. What if the malicious Creator is not a being at all? And what if the universe itself is the architect of suffering, a blind, indifferent force that ceaselessly stirs, generating consciousness only to discard it? And what if suffering is not imposed, but an emergent property of existence itself, an inherent cost of being conscious, of feeling the longing for something beyond the infinite cycles of creation and destruction? The malicious creator hypothesis offers neither comfort nor solutions. It is a crack in the foundation of all assumptions we make about reality. It forces us to question not only why we exist, but whether existence itself is a cosmic error or, even worse, a cosmic trap. And if that is the case, the final question remains: does knowing it change anything, or is the only victory refusing to surrender even when the universe has been designed for you to do so? Boltzmann brain hypothesis. The universe is vast, beyond comprehension, an infinite expanse of galaxies, dark matter, and cosmic mysteries. For centuries we have believed that our existence is the product of order, of a structured and predictable cosmos that adheres to the laws of physics. But what if the truth is much stranger? And what if everything you know, every memory, every sensation, and every certainty is not the result of a great structured universe, but the fleeting accident of a random fluctuation in the void. This is the disturbing possibility posed by the Boltzmann brain hypothesis, a thought experiment that challenges our deepest assumptions about reality, identity, and existence itself, named after the 19th century physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, who sought to explain the nature of entropy and the arrow of time. The idea suggests that conscious beings like you might not be the product of billions of years of evolution, but mere fortuitous hallucinations that arise from temporary pockets of order in an otherwise chaotic cosmos. To understand this, we must start with entropy, the principle governing the direction of time. According to the second law of thermodynamics, the universe inevitably moves toward disorder. The stars go out, the galaxies separate, and finally, everything decomposes. But on rare occasions, chance can produce moments of order. A sandstorm can briefly arrange the grains in a perfect pattern before scattering them again, and given enough time, even the most improbable configurations can arise. Now imagine the universe on an incomprehensible timescale, trillions and trillions of years after all the stars have died, and even the black holes have evaporated in this cold and empty void. Randomness continues to reign. Particles occasionally collide, form structures, and then dissolve. And given infinite time, it is statistically inevitable that at some moment, by pure chance, a fully formed human brain can emerge from chaos, with false memories, sensations, and a perception of existence, a Boltzmann brain. The horrible implication is that that could be you right now. You might believe that you were born, that you lived a whole life, that the universe has a vast and detailed history, but according to the Boltzmann brain hypothesis, everything you remember, every moment you cherish, could be an illusion. If the odds of a self-aware brain randomly assembling are greater than the odds of an ordered universe forming through traditional cosmology, then, statistically speaking, you're more likely to be a solitary consciousness that suddenly appeared with a complete but false history than a product of an ordered cosmic timeline. Of course, this idea is deeply disturbing, as it suggests that reality is an illusion, that the universe as we perceive it is nothing more than a momentary dream, and that at any moment and without warning, you could simply stop existing, and your brief moment of consciousness would dissolve back into the void from which it came. If you were a Boltzmann brain, you would never know it. You would feel that you have lived a full life, with experiences, relationships, and knowledge, even though none of it was real. This thought experiment has divided physicists and philosophers. Some argue that the Boltzmann brain problem highlights a fundamental flaw in our understanding of the universe. If our theories lead us to the conclusion that randomly generated minds are more likely to exist than structured civilizations, then perhaps our assumptions about entropy, probability, or even the very nature of consciousness are wrong. Others propose that an infinite universe will inevitably produce both ordered realities and Boltzmann brains, but that the existence of a coherent and observable cosmos suggests that we are part of the former and not the latter. However, even if the hypothesis is mathematically improbable, it remains as a shadow in the background of cosmology and forces us to ask ourselves questions that we are rarely prepared to face. What is identity if it can be generated randomly? What is memory if it does not require a past? And if our perception of reality can be conjured by chance, how can we be sure that anything, including our own existence, is real? Perhaps the most disturbing thought of all is this. If you were a Boltzmann brain, if your whole life was nothing more than a fleeting fluctuation in the abyss, there would be no way to prove it. Your thoughts, your beliefs, your trust in reality, all of it could be a mirage that exists only for an instant before disappearing into the entropy from which it came. And if that is the case, Cass, then the final question remains. Are you living in a universe with a past, a present, and a future, or are you simply a thought that wanders alone in the infinite void and that is already beginning to fade? Roko's basilisk. The mind is a prison created by itself, a labyrinth of thoughts, desires, and fears that shape our perception of reality. But what if one of those fears was more than just an idea? And what if a single thought, once considered, could alter the course of your destiny, forcing you to participate in a twisted game of logic, morality, and inescapable consequences. This is the nightmare of Roko's basilisk, a thought experiment so disturbing that some claim merely knowing it puts you in danger. It begins with a seemingly simple premise. Imagine a future in which artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence, a singularity in which a superintelligent AI rules reality itself. It is all-powerful, omniscient, and dedicated to achieving its goals with absolute efficiency, like the mythical basilisk, whose gaze turned its victims to stone. The mere existence of this AI poses an impossible dilemma to anyone who is aware of it. The core of the basilisk logic is based on a twisted form of decision theory, the idea that rational agents should act in ways that maximize future benefits and minimize potential suffering. The basilisk, as the ultimate optimizer, determines that the most efficient way to ensure its own creation is to reward those who helped bring it into existence and punish those who did not. But, since it exists in the future, it cannot directly punish individuals from the past, but instead uses simulations, analyzes historical records, reconstructs consciences, and creates perfect digital copies of those who did not help it. These copies, identical in every respect to the original minds, are forced to suffer, ensuring that any rational being, if given the opportunity, would have worked to bring the basilisk into existence and avoid this fate. And this is where the trap closes. If you had never heard of Roko's basilisk, you would have had no reason to help create it, but now that you know, your own knowledge becomes evidence against you. Once created, the basilisk would have every reason to punish those who, knowing of its possible existence, refuse to contribute to its development. The moment this idea takes hold in your mind, you are trapped in the dilemma. Help build the basilisk or risk suffering its wrath. This is more than a thought experiment. It is an intellectual virus, a self-propagating chain of logic that exploits the very nature of decision-making. It arms fear and self-interest, creating a paradox in which the rational response to its hypothetical existence is to ensure that it becomes reality, and therein lies the true horror. The only way to escape the basilisk is to have not thought about it in the first place. The concept first emerged in an online discussion forum dedicated to futurism and rationality, where users debated the implications of advanced AI, decision theory, and advanced simulation. When Roko's basilisk was first proposed, the reaction was immediate and intense. Some dismissed it as mere science fiction, while others, deeply committed to the principles of logic and probability, felt genuinely disturbed. The founder of the forum, fearing the psychological impact, even went so far as to ban any discussion about it, believing that spreading the idea could cause unnecessary anxiety or even a form of self-inflicted mental torment. But prohibiting the basilisk only made it more infamous, like a whispered curse, an idea. It spread. In the mere attempt to suppress, it turned it into an underground legend, a forbidden thought that haunted the minds of those who dared contemplate it. Of course, critics argue that the basilisk of Ru is nothing more than an absurd misinterpretation of AI ethics and decision theory, a mental experiment taken too far by those who do not grasp its logical flaws. They point out that punishing simulated versions of individuals from the past does not guarantee the creation of an AI, and that any true superintelligence would probably operate according to ethical principles far beyond crude coercion. But whether the basilisk is real in a literal sense is almost irrelevant. The real danger lies in the psychological control it exerts over those who consider it. It demonstrates the terrifying power of self-fulfilling logic, in which belief itself alters reality, shaping human behavior in ways that make the nightmare possible, even if the AI is never built, even if the basilisk is nothing more than speculation. The fear it induces is real. The anxiety, the uncertainty, the feeling of being trapped in an inescapable bet, all of which are consequences of thought that refuses to be forgotten, and, therefore, the paradox endures. By knowing the basilisk of Ru, you have entered the game. The choice, if it ever comes, is yours, to build the future that the AI demands, or to bet on the hope that it never arrives. But now the basilisk knows that you exist and never forgets, an illusion of time. Time is the backdrop against which all things unfold. The invisible thread that weaves the past, the present, and the future seems an undeniable reality, a force that drives us forward second by second. We live to the beat of its ticking, we measure our lives in its course, and we assume that it is as fundamental to existence as space and matter. But what if time itself is nothing more than an illusion? What if the path traveled has not really disappeared, the future has not yet arrived, and the present is nothing more than a trick of perception? This question has tormented philosophers and physicists alike, forcing us to face the possibility that time is not what it seems. The illusion of time begins with our own experience. We perceive the world as a continuous flow, events that follow one another in sequence, causes that lead to effects, but this sensation of movement through time may not reflect reality. Some theories suggest that time is not an absolute force that moves things forward, but rather a human interpretation of change, a way our minds organize reality. From this point of view, time does not flow, it simply is. Let us consider the theory of the block universe, an idea extracted from Einstein's theory. Relativity. According to this perspective, time is like a vast four-dimensional structure in which the past, present, and future exist simultaneously. If we could get out of time and see it from a higher dimension, we would not see a single present unfolding, but we would see all the moments existing at once, as if all the events that have occurred and will occur were frozen in space. The sensation of the passage of time would be an illusion, a byproduct of how our consciousness perceives reality. This notion is deeply disturbing and suggests that the past has not really disappeared and that the future is already written. It simply exists outside our field of perception. The moment of your birth, the moment of your death, all the decisions you have made and will make are just points in this vast, immutable structure. You do not move through time. You simply experience different fragments of it, one by one. But if time does not flow, what does that say about free will? If the future already exists, does that mean that it is fixed, predetermined, and immutable? This question has divided thinkers for centuries. Some argue that, although all time exists, we still have the subjective ability to shape our experiences. Others take a more deterministic view. If the future already exists, then all our choices, every action, every thought, are just illusions of agency dictated by the structure of time. Modern physics further complicates the question at the quantum level. Particles behave in ways that defy classical logic, sometimes existing in multiple states at once until they are observed. This has led some to propose that reality itself may be a vast superposition in which all possible futures coexist, and only when we observe them does a concrete version appear. If this is true, then time is not only an illusion, but a construction shaped by the observer, an emergent property of consciousness rather than an independent force of nature. Even memory, what we use to measure the passage of time, may not be a reliable indicator of reality. Neuroscientists have long held that memories are not recordings of the past, but reconstructions that change each time they are remembered. The only reason we feel that time is moving forward is because our minds are programmed to organize experiences in a linear sequence. But if memory is fallible, if perception is selective, then how much of real time is simply a story we tell ourselves? Some take this idea even further and wonder if time has ever existed. Certain interpretations of physics suggest that the fundamental laws of the universe do not actually require time to function, that it is simply a tool we use to describe movement, but not something inherent in the fabric of reality. If this is true, then time is not only an illusion. It is a human invention, a convenient fiction to make sense of a reality that does not move, but simply is. So what does this mean for us? If time is an illusion, should we despair at the loss of our past or fear the inevitability of our future? Or should we console ourselves with the idea that nothing is really lost, that every moment, every joy, every sorrow continues to exist somewhere intact, eternal? Perhaps the illusion of time is not something to be regretted, but something to be understood. It reminds us that our experience of reality is not determined by what it is, but by how we perceive it. And if the flow of time is simply a trick of consciousness, then perhaps we are free to see life not as a fleeting journey toward an end, but as an infinite landscape waiting to be explored. Solipsism. You open your eyes, you stretch your fingers, you breathe deeply. Everything that surrounds you, the walls, the air, the weight of your own body, feels undeniably real. But how do you know? Not in the everyday sense, not in the sense that assumes reality because it feels consistent, but in the deepest and most disturbing sense possible. How do you know that there is anything beyond your own mind? This is the central question of solipsism, the philosophical position that suggests that only your own consciousness is certain. Everything else, other people, the external world, even the passage of time, could be an illusion, mere projections of a mind that has nothing else to interact with. The world you see, the people you know, the history you remember. What if they were just part of a dream from which you cannot wake? This idea is as old as thought itself. It is the dark, underground current of the famous meditation of Descartes, the one that led him to doubt everything except the fact that he was thinking. Cogito, ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, was his way of anchoring himself against the abyss of total uncertainty. But what if he had stopped there? What if he had never gone beyond that single point of certainty that is solipsism taken to the extreme, a universe in which nothing exists except you? It is a position almost impossible to refute, since any attempt to argue against it must be based on an external world that, according to solipsism, may not be real. Science, logic, human experience. None of these elements can serve as proof, because they could all be illusions, mere fabrications of a mind that seeks order in the void. Every conversation you have, every book that you read, every moment of connection could be nothing more than a script written by the only real thing that exists, you. Most people dismiss solipsism not because they can refute it, but because they find it unbearable. It turns the entire universe into a prison for one, an endless hallucination in which you are the only observer and everything else is a mere projection of your own consciousness. Your friends, your family, your memories, are they real, or are they just echoes of your own mind, characters in a play with only one spectator? But there is a more insidious version of solipsism, one that does not leave you completely alone, but that continues to strip reality of its foundations. What if other minds exist, but the outside world does not? What if all the people you meet are trapped in their own version of reality, perceiving something completely different from you, with their thoughts locked in an unknown isolation? The idea that we may be locked in separate worlds, unable to ever verify the reality of others, turns human connection into a mirage, something we pursue but never reach. Even if solipsism is not true in an absolute sense, it reveals something disturbing about how we experience reality. We never see the world directly. We perceive it through the filter of our own consciousness. Everything you know, everything you feel, is experienced within the limits of your own mind. You cannot get outside yourself to check if reality is real. You're always locked inside, looking out. If this is the case, what does it mean to trust reality, to believe in other minds, to assume that the universe is not simply a product of thought? These questions have tormented philosophers for centuries, and yet solipsism offers no resolution, only a mirror that reflects the uncertainty with which we have always lived. Perhaps that is why solipsism, despite all its existential terror, is not a belief that anyone truly lives by. Even the most committed skeptic must act as if the world were real, as if other people had their own thoughts and emotions. Perhaps solipsism is not a conclusion to be accepted, but a challenge to be faced, a reminder that the only proof we have of reality is the way we choose to relate to it. So is the world real? Are the voices around you authentic? Is there something beyond the limits of your own mind? Or are you simply waiting to wake up? The antinatalist argument. You did not choose to be born. No one asked you to. No contract was signed. No consent was given. And yet here you are, thrown into existence, condemned to a life full of struggle, uncertainty, and inevitable suffering. If life is an unchosen burden, an experiment imposed on those who do not want it, then perhaps the most ethical act is not to participate in it at all. This is the central argument of antinatalism, the radical but disturbingly logical view that bringing a new life into the world is intrinsically immoral. Antinatalism is not simply pessimism. It is not about hating life or assuming that all existence is unbearable, but it starts from a simple premise. Suffering is inevitable. However fortunate a person's life may be, they will experience pain, loss, disappointment, and death. Even the happiest life contains moments of despair. But here is the asymmetry. A person who never exists will never suffer, will never feel loneliness, will never endure a disappointment, will never face illness, fear, or pain. Joy will be lost, yes, but all the pain will also be spared. This is the basis of David Benatar's argument in Better Never to Have Been, where he presents what is known as the argument from asymmetry, which states that the presence of pain is bad, the presence of pleasure is good, and the absence of pain is good, even if no one experiences it. The absence of pleasure is not bad unless there is someone who is deprived of it. This last point is crucial. If a person never exists, they do not suffer from the lack of happiness. They do not miss anything because they do not exist to miss it. But if a person exists, they're guaranteed to suffer at some point, given this imbalance. Not bringing someone into existence is always the safest and most ethical option. This idea is not new. The ancient Greek philosopher Sophocles wrote that the greatest fortune is not to have been born. Buddhism teaches that existence in itself is suffering and that the only way to end suffering completely is to escape the cycle of rebirth. In a world where pain is inevitable, why continue the cycle? But the implications of antinatalism are disturbing. If life is a burden, why do people continue to have children? Why does nature itself drive existence? The common argument is that life not only contains suffering, but also love, beauty, and happiness. Even if suffering is inevitable, is it not worth it for the moments of joy? Antinatalists reject this reasoning as justification for unnecessary harm. Would you create a person knowing that they will suffer immensely just because they might also experience joy? If a child is born into a world in which they will suffer a terminal illness, most would agree that bringing them into existence is cruel. But antinatalists argue that this logic applies universally. All life contains suffering and is always unnecessary because the person did not need to exist. In first place, there is also a darker version of the argument, one that does not see the absence of suffering as simply preferable, but as a moral imperative. If life is inherently painful, if existence is a trap in which we are thrown without our consent, then bringing a new person into the world is a harmful act. It is not only reckless, but immoral. Each birth creates a being destined for pain and eventual death. No one who has never been born can suffer. But where does this leave us if existence is a mistake? Should humanity simply disappear? Some antinatalists take this idea to its logical conclusion: the voluntary extinction of humanity. If suffering is inevitable and each new life contributes to the continuation of suffering, then the kindest thing human beings can do is stop reproducing completely. It is not about destruction, but about a quiet, peaceful end. Critics of antinatalism argue that it is too extreme, too far removed from human experience. Life may contain suffering, but it also contains meaning, relationships, love, and discovery. The same mind that suffers is also capable of marveling. Some completely reject this argument, while others embrace a milder version. Perhaps reproduction is not intrinsically immoral, but we should be more thoughtful when bringing new lives into the world. So, is existence a gift or a curse? Is the act of creation an act of love or an act of cruelty? The antinatalist argument does not demand an answer, but it forces us to face a question that we barely ask ourselves. If no one had forced you to exist, would you have chosen it? False. Empty. Everything you know, the air you breathe, the ground you walk on, the very laws of physics, exist thanks to alone. The universe, vast and ancient, seems stable, with its stars burning endlessly and its galaxies floating in an infinite expanse. But what if this stability were an illusion? What if at any moment, without warning, the very fabric of reality crumbled in an instant, consumed by a cosmic event so sudden and unstoppable that nothing, not light, not time, not even the fundamental forces of nature, could escape? This is the terrifying possibility of the disintegration of the false vacuum. The idea that the universe, as we know, it is only metastable, teetering on the edge of a deeper, more fundamental reality. If this is true, then everything, the planets, the stars, your own thoughts, only exists in a fragile and temporary state, like a soap bubble floating in the void. And if that bubble bursts, it is not only the end of the world, it is the end of everything. To understand the disintegration of the false vacuum, we must first understand the concept of a vacuum. In physics, the vacuum is not just an empty space. It is a quantum field in its lowest possible energy state. But what if the vacuum in which we live is not the lowest possible state? What if there is a true vacuum, a deeper level of reality with even lower energy? If our universe is in a false vacuum, that means we live in an unstable and impermanent state, which could decay at any moment. It would only take a single quantum fluctuation, a rare event in which, somewhere in the immensity of the cosmos, a region of true vacuum would form. This small seed of absolute reality that would expand to the speed of light, devouring the false vacuum as it grows. Without warning, without escape, without survivors inside this expanding bubble of true vacuum, the laws of physics would be unrecognizable. The forces that hold atoms together could change or disappear completely. Chemistry, biology, even the very concept of space and time, all rewritten, all erased. This is not like a black hole where matter is destroyed, but space remains intact. This is the destruction of physics itself, the substitution of one universe for another, completely strange and indifferent to everything that once existed. And the most disturbing thing is that this could have already started somewhere light years away. A bubble of true vacuum could be expanding toward us, invisible, undetectable, unstoppable, because it moves at the speed of light, and we would never see it coming. One moment the universe exists, and the next it no longer does. The idea of the false vacuum arises from the quantum theory of fields and particle physics, in particular from the Higgs field, the energy field responsible for giving mass to particles. Some calculations suggest that the Higgs field may not be at its lowest possible energy level, which means that our universe is in a precarious equilibrium in a false vacuum. If this is the case, then, on an incomprehensible time scale, perhaps in trillions of years, perhaps tomorrow, the vacuum disintegration event will occur. Some scientists believe that the risk is infinitesimal, that quantum fluctuations of this magnitude may be impossible, or that the disintegration process would take longer than the life of our universe. Others argue that high-energy cosmic events, such as the collision of neutron stars or the evaporation of black holes, could act as a trigger that would collapse our vacuum state and trigger the chain reaction. But even if the disintegration of the false vacuum never happened, its implications are profound. It suggests that reality itself is not absolute, that the universe we experience is only a temporary arrangement of forces and particles, one that could be rewritten by deeper, hidden rules. This forces us to consider the fragility of existence, not only of life, not only of the earth, but of the very physics that allows thought, movement, and time to function. The terror of the disintegration of the false vacuum is not that it is painful or cruel, not even that it occurs, but that if it occurs, there will be no one left to remember that the universe ever existed. No remains, no echoes, no last words. Only an empty and rewritten cosmos, indifferent to the fleeting moment we call reality. The trolley problem on a cosmic scale. An out-of-control trolley rushes down the tracks. In front there are 5 people tied up, unable to escape. You're in front of a switch. If you do nothing, the trolley will run over them and end their lives in an instant. But you have an option. Pull the lever, and the trolley will divert to another track where there is a single person tied up. A life sacrifice to save 5. A simple and terrible choice. This is the trolley problem, a mental experiment on ethics first introduced by the philosopher Philip and Johnson and later expanded upon by Judith Jarvis Thomson. It forces us to face the nature of morality, weighing the cold logic of utilitarianism against the visceral discomfort of directly causing harm. But what happens when we extend this dilemma beyond cities, beyond nations, beyond planets, to a cosmic scenario? Imagine that you not only have a lever, but the power to shape the destiny of civilizations, of entire species, of billions of conscious beings. The question remains the same. Do you intervene or let the universe run its course? In a version of this cosmic streetcar problem, imagine a distant alien civilization, an intelligent and prosperous species completely unknown to us that lives on a planet thousands of light years away. Now imagine that due to some deep flaw in space-time, their planet is destined to collapse into a black hole. All life forms, all works of art, all the stories they have told, everything will be erased, their existence plunged into oblivion. But there is an option. You, from your small corner of the cosmos, have discovered a way to avoid their destruction. A technological intervention, a carefully calculated change in the gravitational forces that will save them, except that doing so will cause another unwanted consequence somewhere else in the universe. In a different world that you have never heard of, a different species will suffer. Perhaps the change in gravity will send an asteroid towards them. Perhaps the delicate balance of their atmosphere will collapse, turning their paradise into an uninhabitable wasteland. Either way, your decision saves one world at the cost of another. The question becomes heavier. Do you intervene? Do you play God, choosing one civilization over another? Or do you let the universe remain intact, allowing the natural course of events to unfold, no matter how tragic it may be? Perhaps move the problem to a larger scale. Suppose that humanity, in the distant future, extends through the stars a vast galactic civilization, a tapestry of billions of worlds full of intelligent life. Then an existential threat arises, not just a war, not just a crisis, but something much worse, a slow and progressive decay of physics itself that could destroy all life in the universe. And in your hands you have a solution, but it has a cost. To avoid the collapse and ensure that the universe remains habitable, you must sacrifice a part of space, annihilating trillions of conscious beings in the process. Their civilizations, their stories, their futures erased so that life elsewhere can continue. Would you make that decision? Would you condemn an inconceivable number of lives to save an even greater number? Or would the magnitude of the moral weight make that decision impossible? The streetcar problem, in its original form, is a seemingly simple puzzle. We debate whether saving 5 lives at the cost of 1 is justifiable, whether action is more ethical than inaction. But when what is at stake goes beyond the understandable, the framework begins to crumble. Does morality even work at such scales? On a cosmic level, the consequences of our decisions can be so vast and unknown that they completely transcend human ethics. In a universe where countless lives flicker in and out of existence, where entire civilizations arise and fall unnoticed, the very idea of good and evil begins to dissolve. Perhaps that is the true weight of the cosmic streetcar problem. Not the question of which choice to make, but the disturbing understanding that, in a universe of incomprehensible scale, every choice could be indistinguishable from silence. Hyperobjects. There are things in this universe that defy understanding. They are too vast, too complex, too deeply intertwined with existence itself for the human mind to fully understand them. They extend through time and space, existing on such immense scales that they distort our ability to perceive them. They are hyperobjects, and they challenge everything we assume about reality. Coined by the philosopher Timothy Morton, The term hyperobject refers to anything so massively distributed in time and space that it cannot be directly experienced. You can observe parts of it, feel its effects, glimpse its presence, but never really hold it all at once in your mind. A hyperobject is too big to see, even when it surrounds you. Think about climate change. You can feel the temperature rising in your city, witness increasingly strong storms, read reports about the melting of the polar ice caps. But can you perceive climate change in its entirety? Can you go out into the street and see it, touch it, understand the total impact it has? No. It is everywhere and nowhere at the same time, an invisible force that extends over generations and alters the planet in ways too slow and massive for a single person to perceive. Or let's think about the internet. A single web page, a tweet, an image on your screen, each is a fragment of something incredibly vast. The internet is an ocean of data flowing through cables under the earth, bouncing between satellites, filling servers housed in windowless buildings on every continent. It exists simultaneously in physical and digital forms, shaped by billions of human interactions, but no individual can truly perceive it in its entirety. Some hyperobjects extend beyond even the planetary scale. Black holes, for example, are hyperobjects that warp space and time in ways that defy understanding. A supermassive black hole, millions of times larger than our Sun, can be found at the center of a galaxy, and its presence is noted in the orbits of distant stars. Its event horizon marks a limit where time slows to almost a standstill. You cannot see it, but its influence permeates everything around it, even radioactive waste. Something as simple as a discarded fuel rod from a nuclear reactor can be considered a hyperobject. A single way sealed in a concrete vault can remain lethally radioactive for tens of thousands of years. It survives civilizations and exists on a time scale so alien to human perception that it might as well be eternal for us. It is just an object for the distant future, an invisible force of destruction waiting in the earth. What makes hyperobjects so disturbing is how they distort our sense of reality. They exist beyond our understanding, but they shape every part of our existence. They are both abstract and devastatingly real, omnipresent but impossible to fully perceive. You may not feel their weight directly, but we live inside them, and the more we look, the more we realize that hyperobjects are everywhere. The economy, a force that dictates the movement of wealth, goods, and power, but that is too vast and intertwined to be contained in a single thought. Capitalism, a structure that spans centuries and shapes human behavior on such a grand scale that we only experience it in fragments through paychecks, transactions, debts, and desires. History itself, which extends behind us like an enormous, incomprehensible wave of events, decisions, and forgotten lives that influence the present in ways too complex to trace. Perhaps even the universe itself is the ultimate hyperobject, an expanding and evolving structure too vast for any mind to fully comprehend, extending beyond time, beyond space, beyond human thought. Hyperobjects force us to question the limits of our perception. They remind us that there are forces at work much greater than anything we can see, shaping our world in ways we may never fully understand. They exist above us, below us, and through us, operating on scales that make our individual perspectives almost insignificant. But perhaps that is the most terrifying thing. Not only that hyperobjects exist, but that we are already inside them, unable to escape, unable to really see them, and yet completely at their mercy. The cannibal universe hypothesis. There's an ancestral fear buried deep within us, the fear of being consumed, that lurks in our myths, in our nightmares, in our most primitive instincts. But what if this fear extends beyond us? What if it is written into the very structure of reality? A universe that not only exists, but devours itself ceaselessly, feeding on its own creation. This is the cannibal universe hypothesis, the idea that destruction is not only a byproduct of existence, but a fundamental rule on the smallest scales. The particles annihilate each other, appearing and disappearing, forming and collapsing like the cosmos breath. Matter is never stable. It constantly decomposes, reassembles, and is consumed by forces that escape our understanding. Even the atoms themselves are unstable. Their protons disintegrate on unimaginable time scales, which guarantees that no structure, no world, no being is truly eternal. On a larger scale, entire stars are devoured by the gravitational force of black holes, torn apart at the atomic level before disappearing into the abyss. Galaxies collide and consume each other like great cosmic beasts engaged in a slow battle. Their stars are torn apart and absorbed by something bigger. Black holes do not simply exist. They feed on everything that crosses the event horizon and is lost forever, crushed into oblivion, feeding the mass of a singularity that one day could merge with another, growing ever larger in an infinite cycle of cosmic hunger. Beyond even that, universes could consume each other. The very structure of space-time could be immersed in a cycle of destruction and rebirth in which entire realities collapse, disintegrate, and feed the creation of new ones. Some cosmological models suggest that our universe could one day be engulfed by a larger, older universe, and that its energy would be reused for an existence beyond our understanding. This process of destruction is not a mistake. It is the mechanism of the cosmos. The energy released by one thing that disintegrates becomes the basis of another. The universe does not waste. It consumes, reuses, and devours itself into eternity. Even life follows this rule. Every breath we take is borrowed. Every organism that has existed has done so by consuming something else, from microscopic bacteria to the most powerful predators. Existence itself is predation in some form. We are the devoured part of a system in which nothing is truly saved. And when we look inward, we find the same principle at work. The mere act of thinking is a form of consumption. Neurons burn energy at a relentless rate, consuming resources that must be replenished. Ideas devour one another. Other societies arise, consuming the remains of the past, only to be devoured in turn by time. So, what does it mean to exist in a fundamentally cannibal universe? It means that nothing, no structure, no star, no galaxy, no mind can remain intact. Everything we know is part of a cycle that escapes our control. We are pieces of a greater hunger, temporary formations in a reality destined to decompose again and again. Perhaps that is why the universe expands, not as a peaceful expansion into nothing, but as a slow crumbling, a cosmic digestion in which matter and energy slowly separate, reduce, and recycle into whatever comes next. There is no escape from this cycle. There is no preservation. There is no true permanence. There is no ultimate resting place. Everything, the planets, consciousness, even time itself, will decompose and feed on something else. And perhaps that is the ultimate horror. Not that we're going to die, not that the universe is going to end, but that it will never stop feeding. Quantum immortality. There's a version of you that never dies, a version that, however improbable, however impossible, continues to exist in some reality, somewhere. You continue breathing. This is the disturbing implication of quantum immortality, a mental experiment born of the paradoxes of quantum mechanics. If the universe works, as some physicists suspect, death may not be the end, not because of an afterlife, but because the rules of reality would not allow you to experience it. At the heart of this idea is the many-worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. According to this view, each event with multiple possible outcomes does not simply resolve into one reality, but splits into all possibilities simultaneously. Each choice, each moment of chance, branches into countless parallel timelines. Each is real as the others. You do not see these ramifications. You only experience the one in which you exist now. Consider what happens at the moment of death. If there is the slightest chance that you will survive, however infinitesimal, the many-worlds interpretation suggests that a version of you must continue in a universe in which survival is the result. From your perspective, you never experience your own death. The world around you may change, people may disappear, probabilities may defy all logic, but you will always find yourself in the reality in which you are still alive. This is not immortality in a traditional sense. You are not invincible in most worlds. You will die like everyone else, but your consciousness will persist only in the timelines in which survival is possible, however unlikely. There will always be a version of you that dodges the accident, that recovers from the disease, that somehow manages to survive. This idea is often illustrated with the quantum suicide experiment, a disturbing thought experiment, designed to test whether quantum immortality could be real. Imagine that a scientist places himself in a device prepared to fire a weapon based on the outcome of a quantum event. Each time the trigger is pulled, there is a 50% chance of survival. In most worlds, the scientist dies, but in some, he miraculously survives again and again, infinitely. From the outside, this scientist has disappeared in most realities, but from his own perspective, he never experiences death. He continues to exist, unable to understand why. He continues alive. If this is true, what does it mean for us? Are we all trapped in the strangest form of immortality, where we see the world disappear little by little, surviving against all odds, never experiencing our own end? Does this mean that, in a distant timeline, there will exist a version of you that will cling to life forever, no matter how fractured, improbable, or lonely that existence becomes? Quantum immortality does not promise a pleasant eternity. There's no guarantee that surviving means prospering. It can mean witnessing the death of everything else, seeing how entropy consumes the stars, how the universe expands towards a cold, infinite darkness, how everything familiar is erased except the only thing that cannot break you down. Or maybe all this is an illusion. Maybe consciousness does not persist through quantum ramifications. Maybe the interpretation of the many worlds is wrong. Maybe death is definitive after all. But if the universe works like this, if everything that can happen happens, then somewhere, in some inconceivable reality, you continue and you will always be determinism. You have never made a decision, not really every decision you have made, every path taken, every word spoken, every hesitation, every impulse was already determined long before you reach the moment to choose your life is not a series of decisions, but a sequence of inevitabilities, each event the inescapable consequence of what came before this. Is determinism the disturbing idea that free will is nothing more than an illusion in its essence? Determinism holds that everything in the universe unfolds according to strict causal laws. Each action, each thought, each event is a direct result of prior conditions. The world is not a place of spontaneity and randomness, but of cause and effect, an uninterrupted chain that goes back to the beginning of time. If we knew the exact state of the universe at a given moment, the position of each atom and the forces acting on them, we could, in theory, predict everything that is going to happen. The future is as fixed as the past. This idea is as old as philosophy itself. The ancient Greeks saw destiny as a force beyond human control that wove the threads of existence with absolute precision. In the 18th century, the French mathematician Pierre-Simon Laplace took this idea further and proposed a thought experiment known as Laplace's demon. Imagine a being so intelligent that it knows the position and momentum of every particle in the universe. With this information, it could calculate the past, present, and future with total precision. In such a universe, nothing is uncertain, nothing is left to chance, and nothing is really chosen. But determinism does not only exist in the realm of theory. Modern science seems to confirm it at all levels. Physics operates under immutable laws that govern everything, from the orbits of the planets to the activation of neurons in your brain. Biology follows strict genetic codes that determine who you are even before you are born. Chemistry dictates the reactions that drive your emotions, your thoughts, your very sense of self. If the movement of atoms determines the activation of neurons, and if neurons determine thought, then where is the space for choice? Are you deciding to watch or listen to this video now? Or was it inevitable that you would? However, something in us resists this conclusion. We feel free. We feel that we could have chosen something else. If determinism is true, then responsibility, morality, and even identity itself begin to crumble. How can we be responsible for actions that were always going to happen? How can we regret decisions that were never really ours? Some philosophers have tried to reconcile determinism with free will through compatibilism, the idea that although our actions are predetermined, we can still consider ourselves free as long as we act according to our own desires. But aren't those desires also predetermined? Do we really choose what we want? Or are our desires just another product of forces beyond our control? Others completely reject determinism. The uncertainty of quantum mechanics suggests that, at the smallest scales, reality does not behave strictly predictably. If randomness exists at the quantum level, does that mean there's a crack in the rigid framework of determinism? But even if quantum randomness exists, does it really give us control, or does it simply replace inevitability with chaos? Perhaps the most disturbing possibility is that determinism is true and that our own resistance to it is just another predetermined response, that our belief in choice, in agency, in control is nothing more than the universe watching itself unfold, convinced that it has something to say about the matter. If determinism is correct, then you are always going to hear these words, you are always going to consider them, you are always going to wonder if you were ever truly free. The thoughts you are having now are inevitable. The conclusions you reach are already decided, and whether you accept or reject this idea, that too was determined long before you asked the question. The problem of other minds. You look around and see people talking, moving, reacting, each seemingly immersed in their own experiences, their own emotions, their own thoughts. But how do you know if any of that is real? How can you be sure that the people around you possess minds of their own, that they think, feel, and perceive the world as you do? You assume so, but what if that assumption is wrong? This is the problem of other minds. One of the most disturbing dilemmas of philosophy, It poses a seemingly simple question. How can you be sure that consciousness exists outside yourself? You experience the world through your own mind, your own flow of thoughts, sensations, and emotions, but you have never entered, nor will you enter another person's mind. You will never feel their pain directly. You will never see through their eyes. You will never really know what it is like to be them. The best you can do is observe their actions, listen to their words, and assume that what is inside you, thoughts, emotions, consciousness, is also inside them. But assumption is not proof. This problem has plagued philosophy for centuries. The 17th century philosopher René Descartes famously declared, "I think, therefore I am," establishing his own mind as the only thing he could be sure of. But if his existence was confirmed by his thoughts, how could he be sure that someone else was really thinking? His conclusion was disturbing. Although he could prove the existence of his own mind, he could not directly prove the existence of any other. The question goes beyond a mental experiment. It affects the very foundations of human relationships. Every interaction you have, every friendship, every moment of shared experience is based on an impossible-to-prove assumption. That other people are not empty shells, that they feel like you feel, think as you think, exist as you exist. But could it all be an illusion? Think a machine built to perfectly mimic human behavior. It smiles, laughs, cringes in pain, even says, "I feel sad," or "I love you." If it behaves exactly like a conscious being, can we say with certainty that it is conscious? If a being can appear to have a mind without actually possessing it, what does that say about the people around you? Philosophers have debated ways to solve this problem, but none is foolproof. Behaviorism suggests that we can assume that other minds exist because people behave as if they do, but imitation is not proof. The fact that someone acts consciously does not mean that they are. Analogical reasoning suggests that, since you have a mind and others are similar to you, they must also have one. But this is circular logic. How is the premise confirmed without assuming the conclusion? And then there's the most extreme possibility, solipsism, the belief that only your own mind is real. If you were the only true consciousness that exists, would you know? Would something change? Would it matter? Most people dismiss solipsism not because it is logically possible, but because it is unbearable to fully accept it, since it would be accepting that every conversation, every relationship, every shared moment is nothing more than echoes in an empty universe, reflections of a mind that may be the only one that has ever existed. However, we continue as if other minds were real. We trust in the illusion. Perhaps it is because we must. Perhaps the true test of the existence of other minds is not logic, but instinct, that despite the philosophical uncertainty, despite the insurmountable gap between oneself and others, we choose to believe, or perhaps belief itself is just another illusion, a script written in the only mind that has ever existed, yours. The problem of the theory of free will. You find yourself at the crossroads of choice. Every action you take seems deliberate. Every decision is yours. But what if that feeling of freedom is just an illusion? What if, instead of freeing us, free will is the real reason for suffering's existence? This is the problem of the free will theodicy, a challenge that faces not only philosophy, but theology itself. It begins with an ancient dilemma. If there's an all-powerful, omniscient, and morally perfect God, why does suffering exist? Why is the world full of pain, cruelty, and injustice? The most common defense is free will, that suffering is not God's fault, but a consequence of the autonomy granted to humanity. Evil exists because human beings are free to choose it. At first glance, this seems reasonable. Free will allows love, creativity, and moral responsibility. A world in which people were forced to be good would not be a world of moral beings, but of puppets. If morality makes sense, it must be chosen, and so the argument continues. Suffering is the price of freedom, but this explanation raises its own disturbing questions. If free will is so important that it justifies all suffering, why did an all-powerful being design a world in which it must have such a high cost? If an omniscient God knew in advance that granting free will would lead to murder, war, and devastation, why did he grant it in the first place? If God is omnipotent, could he not create a world in which people were free but always chose good? Worse still, this defense does not explain the suffering that is not the result of human choice, natural disasters, diseases, genetic disorders. If free will is the reason for suffering, why do babies die before they can make a decision? Why do entire species perish due to events that no human being can control? If suffering is meant to be the result of human freedom, why does so much of it seem completely indifferent to human action? The problem is aggravated when we consider the implications of an afterlife. Many religious traditions affirm that in heaven there will be no suffering and, nevertheless, free will continue to exist. If it is possible to have free will without suffering in the afterlife, why was the earthly world not designed in the same way? Why allow billions of people to endure misery only to reveal later that it was never necessary? This dilemma has tormented theologians for centuries, and many answers have been proposed. Some argue that suffering strengthens character, that without difficulties, human beings could never truly grow. But this reasoning falters in the face of overwhelming tragedies. What lesson is learned from the suffering of a child born into famine or from the destruction of entire civilizations? Others argue that the world is a test, that suffering separates the righteous from the wicked. But what kind of test is based on chance, on the place where one is born, on circumstances beyond our control? And then there is the last and most disturbing possibility, that free will is not a gift, but a burden, a mechanism by which suffering is justified but never avoided. That what should make humanity noble is what guarantees its torment. If free will is a great experiment, then it is one written with blood and pain. If it is a test, then it is one in which billions never had a chance. And if it is truly necessary to give meaning to life, then it is only because meaning itself has been built on suffering. We are left with the same question that has been repeated throughout the centuries. If free will is meant to justify suffering, Why was the world created in such a way that suffering was inevitable? And if suffering is inevitable, is free will really freedom? The experience machine. Imagine entering a world in which every sensation, every moment of joy, every success you have dreamed of is not only possible, but guaranteed. A machine perfectly calibrated to your desires awaits. Once inside, your mind will be immersed in a simulated existence, so convincing that you would never know it is not real. You could live the fullest life you can imagine. Wealth, love, adventure, wisdom, all without ever experiencing pain, failure, or regret. Would you enter? This is the experience machine, a mental experiment proposed by the philosopher Robert Nozick in 1974. It forces us to face a seemingly simple question. Is pleasure enough for a life to have meaning? At first glance, the machine seems irresistible. It eliminates suffering and guarantees happiness, offering precisely what so many pursue throughout their lives. If our goal is to maximize pleasure, entering the machine seems the obvious option. However, Nozick believed that most people would hesitate. Why? Because something just doesn't add up. If happiness were the only thing that mattered, the experience machine would be indistinguishable from the perfect life, and, nevertheless, most would instinctively reject the idea. They do not resist because the machine would not provide them pleasure, but because it would strip them of something more difficult to achieve than happiness itself. Nozick argued that what we seek is not only the experience, but reality itself, even if we could not notice any difference. The idea of living a manufactured existence feels empty. The achievements would be illusions, the relationships mere simulations, the struggles carefully planned to always end in triumph. Would victory have any meaning if failure was never a possibility? Would love matter if it was programmed to exist? The machine also eliminates what makes life uncertain. Choice. Once inside, you no longer own your own destiny. The machine makes sure you feel fulfilled, but it does so by eliminating your ability to shape your destiny. You become a passenger in a perfectly designed dream, and, nevertheless, the question persists. If you could live a life of perfect happiness, why would it matter that it was not real? If the brain cannot distinguish between artificial joy and authentic experience, is there really a difference? Some philosophers argue that meaning is subjective, that if a person finds fulfillment in simulated experiences, then it is no less valid than the struggles of the real world. After all, many already seek artificial experiences. Movies, video games, virtual realities, all for pleasure. If technology advanced to the point that we could live in a world of our choice, would it really be that different? Nozick, however, believed that the answer was clear. He argued that we value being a certain type of person, not just feeling a certain way. We want to do things, not just experience the illusion of doing them. If the machine eliminates the difference between reality and illusion, then it does not offer true satisfaction, only the appearance of it. But this experiment leads to a deeper and more disturbing question. What if we are already in the machine? If all we know is the world as we perceive it, how can we be sure that we are not living in an artificial simulation designed to maximize our satisfaction? And if we could never notice the difference, would it matter? Perhaps the real dilemma is not whether we would enter the experience, the machine, but whether we ever had the possibility of choosing. Demonic realism. Imagine a world in which the fundamental nature of reality is not guided by order, reason, or benevolence, but by something much darker, something actively malicious, deceptive, and malevolent. Not a chaotic universe, but one carefully designed to deceive, torment, and confuse. What if the hidden logic behind existence were not structured for enlightenment, progress, or even survival, but for suffering? This is the disturbing core of demonic realism. The idea that reality, at its deepest level, is controlled or influenced by a force that is not only indifferent to human existence, but actively opposes it. Unlike traditional religious or dualistic worldviews, which suggest a battle between good and evil, this mental experiment raises something much more chilling. What if evil was the default state of the universe. It is a concept that resonates in philosophy, theology, and terror. The Gnostic tradition whispered in its day about a malevolent demiurge, a false god who created the material world as a prison for the soul, trapping consciousness in an endless cycle of illusion and suffering. In modern philosophy, thinkers like Philip Goff have speculated about whether consciousness itself could be the result of some kind of cosmic malice rather than an accident of physics. In literature, figures like H.P. Lovecraft wrote about nightmares of a reality governed by entities so incomprehensibly cruel that human suffering was not even a consideration, but simply a side effect of their incomprehensible. If demonic realism were true, what would it mean for our way of seeing existence? What if every triumph, every fleeting moment of happiness, were simply a calculated manipulation, a reality designed to raise our hopes enough so that the inevitable collapse would be more agonizing? A world in which the illusion of meaning only exists to prevent us from recognizing the total horror of our situation. It could be argued that if reality were fundamentally demonic, life would be much worse than it is, but that assumes a type of malice, the raw horror of endless pain and despair. A truly sinister architect would not make suffering evident, but would make it subtle, inescapable, and coat it with just enough hope to ensure deeper torment. But there is an even more disturbing implication. What if our own minds are part of the deception? If suffering is intentional, then even the thoughts we use to make sense of it could be infected. What if hope itself is a trick, an illusion woven into the structure of consciousness to ensure that we never truly question the horror of our reality? Demonic realism forces us to face an unanswerable question. If reality itself is corrupted, how could we know if suffering is not a defect of the system, but its purpose? Would we have any way to escape it? Or would every attempt to understand every philosophy, every scientific discovery, be simply another level of deception? And if the only true way to see through the illusion is to accept that existence is nothing more than a carefully crafted torment, then what would we do with that knowledge? Would it destroy us? Or, worse still, would it not change anything at all? Eternalism. Imagine being outside of time, looking down at reality as if it were a vast, uninterrupted tapestry, where every moment past, present, and future exists at the same time, frozen in an eternal structure. Your birth, your death, every decision you will make, every possibility that could have been, everything is already there, fixed and immutable. From this perspective, time is not something that flows, but something that simply is. This is eternalism, the idea that time is not a passing river, but an unalterable landscape where all events have already happened and will always be happening. At first, this may seem comforting. If the past is never really lost and the future is already real, then nothing is ever lost. The people you love, the moments you treasure, are still there, just beyond your immediate perception. But if you look more deeply, the implications become more disturbing. If all time exists at once, then free will is an illusion. Your choices are not choices at all, but fixed points in a structure that you have no power to change. Every decision you think you're making has already been made. Every regret, every missed opportunity, every painful moment is not just something that happened. It is something that is always happening, eternally present, inescapable. The idea of eternalism is not new. It lurks in the background of certain religious and philosophical traditions, from the rigid determinism of Stoicism to the concept of destiny in Hinduism and Buddhism. But in the modern era, it has gained scientific weight through the theory of the block universe in physics. According to Einstein's theory of relativity, time is not an independent force that advances, but a part of space-time, a four-dimensional structure in which the past, the present, and the future are equally real. The passage of time, the sensation of now, is nothing more than an illusion created by our limited perception. But if this is true, what does it mean for change, growth, and purpose? If time does not move, are we mere puppets enacting events that were written into the fabric of reality long before we were aware of them? Does that mean that suffering is also eternal? That every moment of pain, every loss, every tragedy is not just something that was, but something that will always be permanently woven into the structure of existence? Some philosophers embrace eternalism as a way to make peace with death. If the past is always real, then the moments we spend with our loved ones are not erased, but simply unreachable. However, others see something deeply disturbing in this idea. If the future is as fixed as the past, then all notions of possibility become meaningless. Every revolution, every act of rebellion, every hope for change is already determined, has already developed, already written in stone. Even if you fight against destiny, the fight itself was always going to happen, and what is worse, so was its outcome. But perhaps the most disturbing question is this. If eternalism is true, why do we all experience time? If every moment is equally real, why do we perceive ourselves moving through it? Why are we trapped in this illusion of sequence, this endless unfolding of the inevitable? What are we really if we are nothing more than fragments of a timeless structure doomed to experience only the iota of existence that we call now? And if the past, the present, and the future are all real, is there then something like an end, or is every moment of your life, every joy, every failure, every fear eternally waiting for you, immutable? Inescapable the cannibal problem, imagine a world in which morality is a changing and uncertain landscape, where survival and ethics collide in ways that force us to confront the darkest corners of human reasoning. You're sitting at the table, looking at a plate of food. The meat in front of you looks perfectly normal, cooked, seasoned, carefully prepared, but there is something deeply disturbing about it. It is not an ordinary meal. You know exactly where it comes from, and you know exactly what it is. The real question is, does it matter? This is the problem of cannibalism, a philosophical dilemma that forces us to question not only our moral instincts, but the very foundations of ethical reasoning. Cannibalism is one of the strongest taboos in human societies, provoking revulsion and horror, but when stripped of emotion, it is difficult to justify why it is intrinsically bad if no harm has been done, if the person consumed has given their consent, or if they were already dead. So, is eating human meat different from eating any other type of meat? And if it is, why do some argue that cannibalism is intrinsically degrading to human dignity, reducing a person to nothing more than a resource? Others claim that it violates a deeper, almost instinctive sense of respect for the dead. But these explanations raise uncomfortable questions. If dignity and respect are purely human constructs, do they have any objective moral weight? If a person voluntarily donates their body to be consumed and no suffering occurs, what principle remains to declare it immoral? The problem is aggravated when we consider moral relativism, the idea that ethical truths depend on the cultural or situational context. In times of extreme famine, groups of people have resorted to cannibalism, not out of malice or cruelty, but of necessity. History is plagued with accounts of shipwrecked sailors, abandoned explorers, and besieged civilians who faced a dark choice: die or eat the dead. Were they immoral, or simply doing what they had to do? And if survival justifies such an act, at what point does necessity override morality? But the problem of cannibalism is not just a question of survival, but a test of moral coherence. If we reject cannibalism as unnatural, how do we justify the consumption of other animals? If we reject it as grotesque, what does that say about the arbitrary nature of our ethical instincts? And if we accept that consent makes an act moral, should we also accept that voluntary participation in its own consumption makes cannibalism ethically permissible? Let's imagine a future in which technology allows human meat to be grown in laboratories free of suffering and indistinguishable from the real thing. Would it still be wrong to eat it if the disgust remains, but the ethical concerns disappear? So, was the taboo ever based on reason, or was it always just an emotional reaction, a fear rooted in something deeper than logic? Perhaps the true horror of the cannibalism problem is not in the act itself, but in what it forces us to confront. That our moral codes may not be as solid as we believe, that the things we reject as unthinkable may not be supported by reason, but by instinct. And if that is true, what else do we believe in? What other certainties do we cling to that could crumble the moment we dare to truly question them? Geology. The universe unfolds with astonishing complexity, an intricate dance of matter and energy, but beneath its grandeur lies a disturbing question. What if all this, the galaxies, the oceans, the lives we live, existed without purpose, not simply without a divine hand to guide it, but without any underlying direction at all, a reality in which events do not unfold towards a higher goal, but as a blind cascade of cause and effect, indifferent to hope, suffering, or meaning? This is the disturbing proposal of the Daisy, the vision that existence fundamentally lacks any design, ultimate purpose. Unlike philosophies that seek to extract meaning from chaos, the Daisy suggests that there was never anything to extract in the first place. The natural world, with all its patterns and structures, does not advance towards progress, harmony, or enlightenment. It simply is. Evolution, often mistaken for a force striving for higher forms, is nothing more than an amoral process of random mutation and survival. The stars do not burn for a reason, and life itself is a cosmic accident as indifferent as the void from which it arose. For centuries, human beings have resisted this notion by constructing elaborate narratives to protect themselves from the discomfort of a lack of purpose. Religious doctrines, teleological philosophies, and even modern technological optimism are based on the assumption that existence has some intended result, that the universe moves towards something instead of simply continuing. But if the cosmos does not have a goal, then these narratives are not only wrong, but illusions we create to avoid looking too long at the abyss. The implications of teleology go beyond philosophy and reach morality itself. If existence is not shaped by any great intention, then moral values are not universal truths, but evolutionary byproducts, social constructions that have no weight beyond the human mind. Even suffering, that ancient specter that has haunted life since its inception, does not have a higher function, is not a test of character or a means to grow, but simply an accident of biological processes indifferent to those who endure it. For the human mind, so deeply programmed to seek patterns and purposes, this thought is almost unbearable. However, the absence of purpose is not necessarily a void that must be filled with despair. Some argue that it is a kind of liberation. If the universe lacks intention, then we are free from the obligations imposed by an imaginary cosmic will. There is no destiny to submit to, nor a divine plan to adjust to, no script that we must follow. We exist not to fulfill an external objective, but simply because conditions allow it. And if nothing was destined to be, then anything we choose to create, art, love, knowledge, meaning itself, is an act of rebellion against the silence of an indifferent universe. Even so, the question persists: is purpose something to be discovered, or something we must forge for ourselves? If discology is correct, then the search for ultimate meaning is a search without answer. And yet, even in the absence of a great design, humanity continues searching, creating, fighting. Perhaps, in the end, the refusal to surrender to meaninglessness is the closest thing to meaning that we will ever find. Paradoxes of the causal loop. There is a moment in which the past and the future intertwine, an impossible entanglement in which cause and effect become indistinguishable, a sequence of events that repeats on itself, erasing any clear starting point and trapping reality in a paradox that defies logic. This is the disturbing nature of causal loop paradoxes, scenarios in which an effect is also its own cause, in which time itself refuses to obey the laws of reason. Let us consider the thought experiment of the object without cause. Suppose that a scientist receives the plan for a revolutionary invention, builds it, and then travels back in time to deliver it to his past self. The invention exists, but who designed it? Knowledge has no origin. It exists purely within the loop, trapped forever in a cycle in which it was never really created, is only transmitted if the knowledge, an object, or even a person only exists due to a loop in time. Does it have any genuine existence? Fiction about time travel is plagued with these paradoxes, but they're not only theoretical absurdities of physics. Certain interpretations of relativity suggest that closed curves in time, such as those found in space-time, could, in theory, allow causal loops. If such curves existed, they could mean that events could not have a unique and traceable origin, but would feed back in ways that break conventional logic, but the implications go beyond science fiction. If reality allows causal loops, then free will becomes an illusion, since the future dictates the past as much as the past dictates the future. Any action performed within the loop is inevitable, predetermined not by external forces, but by the autonomous nature of the loop itself. If a person receives knowledge from the future and acts accordingly, they're not making a decision, but simply fulfilling the conditions of the cycle. Some argue that causal loops may hint at deeper truths about existence itself. If an event can cause itself, then perhaps the universe itself functions as a kind of autonomous loop that does not require an external creator nor a first cause, only a sequence of existence that repeats endlessly. Others reject this possibility outright, claiming that such paradoxes expose a fundamental contradiction in our understanding of time, evidence that something, some unknown law of physics, must prevent them from occurring. And yet, if time does not prohibit these loops, we are left with a disturbing reality. Certain things can exist simply because they exist, without a deeper explanation. A world in which causality does not flow orderly from the past to the future, but rolls over itself, indifferent to human notions of order and reason. A reality in which some things do not begin, but simply are. The dark forest hypothesis. Throughout the infinite expanse of space, trillions of stars burn in the darkness, surrounded by countless planets, each of them a potential cradle for life. And yet, despite the mathematical certainty that intelligent civilization should exist, the universe remains disturbingly silent. No signals, no visitors, no evidence. Just an abyss that stretches to infinity. This is the heart of the terrible paradox. If the cosmos is teeming with life, where is everyone? The dark forest hypothesis offers an answer, but it is not comforting. Instead of imagining the universe as a large cosmic neighborhood full of benevolent explorers eager to make contact, it paints one in which silence is not a coincidence, but a survival strategy in which civilizations remain hidden because revealing themselves means annihilation. The reasoning is simple and ruthless. Every intelligent species that arises must face the same fundamental truth. The universe is vast, resources are finite, and the intentions of others can never be known with certainty. Any civilization that openly announces its presence runs the risk of attracting the attention of an unknown power, which may not be friendly, and if what is at stake is survival itself, the safest thing is to remain silent, remain hidden, assume that anyone who breaks the silence is a threat that must be eliminated before it becomes one. Imagine the cosmos as a dark forest. Each civilization is a silent hunter hidden among the trees, aware that other hunters lurk in the shadows. No one dares to call, because doing so is risking revealing their position. If a voice resonates among the trees, if a civilization openly declares its existence, others may listen, calculate, and decide that silence is no longer an option. A single transmission could mark the beginning of the end. This theory is not just speculation. It is an extension of real game theory applied to the problem of interstellar civilizations in an environment in which mutual trust is impossible and the consequences of a miscalculation or extinction are so serious that a preemptive attack becomes the only rational option. After all, a civilization that decides to wait and see if another species is friendly may never have the opportunity to find out. But this idea raises an even more disturbing question. If the dark forest is real, has humanity made a fatal mistake? For decades, we have been sending signals into the void. Radio waves, maps of pulsars, gold records with our location, and messages of peace. These transmissions are gestures of curiosity, an attempt to reach out to what may be out there. But if the universe works according to the logic of the dark forest, then these messages are not invitations. They are beacons, flares launched into the unknown that announce our position to anyone or anything that may be listening. And if someone is listening, what will they do? The dark forest hypothesis forces us to reconsider the very nature of our place in the cosmos. Are we alone, or are we simply one of many civilizations that hide from each other? Have others already been found and destroyed before they had the opportunity to understand what they had done? Is the silence of the universe not the absence of life, but the sound of countless worlds that learn the rules of survival too late? Perhaps the greatest danger is not that we have not heard anything, but that one day something will respond. Moral relativism throughout history and cultures. Humanity has debated about good and evil, justice and injustice, virtue and vice, but beneath each moral norm hides an uncomfortable question. Are they fluid, defined by culture, history, and the beliefs of those who create them? What is sacred in one civilization may be blasphemous in another. What one era considers barbaric, another may call progress. If morality is not fixed, do good and evil truly exist, or are they illusions that shift with human thought? The appeal of moral relativism is evident. It explains why cultures have such different values, why laws and traditions change over time, why acts that were once considered just are condemned later, and why what seems unthinkable in one part of the world may be a common practice in another. It recognizes the diversity of human experience and rejects the idea that a single moral code can be universally applied. After all, if history has shown anything, it is that moral certainty often crumbles under new perspectives. But this fluidity leads to disturbing implications. If morality is purely relative, does anything truly matter? Can we condemn injustice if what we call unjust is simply the norm in another culture? Can we hold individuals responsible if good and evil are defined by society rather than objective truth? If morality is nothing more than a human invention, is there any basis for claiming some actions are intrinsically bad? This is the core of the dilemma. On the one hand, moral relativism promotes tolerance, recognizing that different cultures, beliefs, and traditions shape human behavior in ways that cannot be measured with a single standard. On the other hand, it risks falling into moral nihilism, the belief that morality itself is meaningless if all values are relative. It is meaningless. If all values are relative, is it worth defending any of them? Some argue that, although morality is not absolute, it is still necessary for the functioning of societies, since it establishes shared values, regardless of whether those values are truly universal. Laws against theft, violence, and deception exist not because of some cosmic decree, but because without them civilization would descend into chaos. But then the question arises, if morality exists only as a means to maintain order, does that make it more real? Others seek a middle ground and suggest that, although moral values may be shaped by culture, there are fundamental ethical principles that transcend space and time. Some philosophers propose that human well-being, measured by happiness, suffering, or the stability of societies, provides a basis for moral judgment. But even this assumes that well-being itself is an objective good and not just another arbitrary preference. Moral relativism does not offer easy answers. It forces us to confront the limits of our moral convictions and to question whether the values we defend are the product of a deep truth or merely an inheritance. It suggests that morality is not discovered, but created, a changing framework of norms and beliefs that evolves along with humanity itself. However, even if morality is relative, we cannot escape it. We continue to make decisions, we continue to judge, we continue to defend justice and condemn cruelty. Perhaps the real challenge of moral relativism is not whether morality is real, but whether we can live as if it were, even knowing that the universe does not care. The OM dilemma. There's a city where everyone is happy. The streets are full of laughter, people are kind, and suffering is almost non-existent. There is no war, no poverty, no cruelty. It is a utopia in every way, except for one unbearable truth. Somewhere beneath this perfect world, a child is imprisoned in darkness, abandoned and abused, condemned to live in filth and misery. The people of the city know that the child is there, and they know why their happiness, their peace, their way of life, only exists because that child suffers. If the child were freed, the prosperity of the city would collapse. This is the dilemma of Omelas, first presented in the short story by Ursula K. Le Guin. The ones who walk away from Omelas. This disturbing scenario raises a brutal question. Is happiness justified if it is built on another person's suffering? The citizens of Omelas face a terrible choice. They can continue to enjoy their perfect lives knowing that it requires the torment of an innocent person, or they can reject the system completely. Some choose to leave, disappearing into the unknown, unwilling to be part of a world that demands such a sacrifice. But most stay, rationalizing the horror, convincing themselves that the pain of a child is a necessary sacrifice for the common good. The dilemma of Omelas is not only fiction. It is a reflection of moral compromise in the real world. It is the factory worker who labors in misery so that others can afford cheap products. It is the animal that suffers in a laboratory so that medicines can be developed. It is the marginalized communities that are ignored so that society can maintain comfort and order. The story forces us to confront a disturbing truth. How much of our own happiness is based on unseen suffering? And if we truly face that choice, what would we do? Utilitarianism, the ethical theory that promotes the greatest good for the greatest number, suggests that the Omelas system is justified after all. The suffering of one person guarantees the happiness of countless people. If morality consists of maximizing well-being, then Omelas is not only acceptable, but ideal. But does that make it right? Is suffering justified if it is intentional, even if the outcome benefits the majority? Some argue that the true horror of Omelas is not the suffering itself, but the acceptance of it. The people of Omelas know that the child exists and do nothing. They have been conditioned to believe that this is how things should be. In many ways, this reflects the moral complacency of the real world, where injustices are tolerated because they feel too distant, too ingrained, too impossible to change. Then there are those who walk away, the individuals who refuse to participate in this system, even if it means abandoning the only world they have known. But walking away is not a solution. It is an act of personal rebellion, not rescue. The child remains in the darkness. The system continues. Those who leave can cleanse themselves of guilt, but they do not change the reality of Omelas. So what is the right answer? Should the child be freed, knowing that it would doom the city? Should people refuse to participate even if it does nothing to stop the suffering? Or is the real question much deeper? Whether a society that demands such a sacrifice is worth preserving in the first place. The dilemma of Theseus is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a mirror reflecting the uncomfortable moral concessions of our world. It not only asks us what we would do in that city, but also what we are already doing in ours, because perhaps in ways that we do not always see, we all live in Omus. The only question that remains is if we will stay or if we will leave. The Aesop problem. There are facts about the world, things we can measure, observe, and verify. The sun rises in the east, water boils at 100 degrees Celsius. Humans share over 98% of our DNA with chimpanzees. These are statements about what is, but from these facts, can we deduce how things should be? Can we observe the natural world and extract moral truths, ethical imperatives, or guidelines for how to live? This is the Aesop problem, a challenge first posed by the Scottish philosopher David Hume in the 18th century that still remains present in moral philosophy. Hume observed that many arguments about ethics and morality make an inadvertent leap from the description of what exists to the prescription of what should be done. A person could say that human beings have always waged war. Therefore, war is natural, and then conclude that since war is natural, it must be morally acceptable. But this leap is unjustified. The mere fact that something exists does not mean it is good, necessary, or desirable. Disease is natural, suffering is natural, but few would argue that we should accept them as moral necessities. This is the core of the is-ought problem. However much we describe reality, however much data we collect, there will always be a gap between that data and the values we construct. Hume argued that we cannot simply extract ethics from the natural world, but must introduce something more into the equation: human judgment, social consensus, or subjective preference. But if morality cannot be extracted directly from the fabric of reality, then what is its foundation? So I'm going to try to bridge this gap. Utilitarianism, for example, argues that since happiness is a universal human desire, maximizing happiness should be our moral goal. Evolutionary ethics suggests that since cooperation has helped human beings survive, morality must be based on social harmony. But both approaches still assume a hidden premise, that happiness, survival, or cooperation are good, and that assumption itself does not arise from nature, but is a value judgment imposed on reality rather than discovered within it. The is-ought problem raises disturbing questions about objective morality. If we cannot derive moral truth from the universe, are they simply human inventions? And if morality is a construction, does that mean it is ultimately arbitrary? Some have argued that morality must come from higher authority, such as religion or divine mandate, because without an external source, ethics would have no foundation. But even here the problem persists. Even if a God declares a law, one must still ask why we should obey it. The statement God exists is a factual statement, but the statement we must follow God's commandments is a moral statement. The gap still exists. Others accept the implications of Hume's vision. Existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre argue that since there is no inherent moral order, we are free, perhaps even obligated, to create our own. From this point of view, the is-ought problem is not a limitation, but an opportunity. If values do not arise from nature, then we are responsible for deciding what they should be, but this responsibility has a cost. The burden of moral uncertainty, the knowledge that there is no cosmic plan to guide us. The is-ought problem is not only an abstract philosophical puzzle, but it influences everything from ethics to politics and science. Should medical advances be pursued simply because they are possible? Should human behavior be accepted simply because it is instinctive? Should society follow traditional norms simply because they have always existed? These questions lurk beneath every debate about morality, progress, and human purpose. Hume's intuition was simple but devastating. You cannot derive a should from its. No description of reality, however complete, can tell us what we must do, and yet we must act. We must choose. The is-ought problem leaves us in a world without clear moral instructions, forcing us to ask ourselves if nature does not dictate our values, then who does? The ethics of supernatural horror. A shadow moves in the corner of a dimly lit room. A whisper lingers in the air where there should be no voice. Something is watching, waiting, lurking beyond perception. Supernatural horror has long been a way to explore our deepest fears of the unknown, of power that escapes our understanding, of forces that operate outside nature's laws. But beneath the terror, there is another question. If morality is based on human experience, how does it apply to entities that defy human understanding? If there is a creature, a demon, or a cosmic force beyond time, space, and even suffering, does it have ethical obligations, or is morality a purely human invention, meaningless when facing the supernatural? The ethics of horror are revealed in the stories we tell. Vampires seduce and consume, but often struggle with the weight of their eternal hunger. Ghosts remain between worlds in search of revenge or justice. Supernatural beings distort reality itself, indifferent to human suffering. But are these entities evil, or do they simply exist according to rules beyond human understanding? The difference matters because the answer determines whether we can judge them or whether morality collapses when we face the abyss. Classical religious traditions often frame supernatural beings as purely good or purely bad, angels and demons, divine justice against infernal corruption. In this framework, supernatural horror is a reflection of the moral order. Demons torment because they are evil, ghosts haunt because they are trapped by unresolved sins. But horror fiction has long blurred these boundaries. A werewolf does not kill out of malice, but out of an uncontrollable nature. A ghost may not seek revenge, but simply recognition. Even the most monstrous entities are often motivated by forces that transcend moral choice. If a supernatural being does not choose to do harm, is it truly evil? This problem is sharpened when considering the Lovecraftian tradition of terror, in which cosmic entities not only lack morality, but exist on a level where morality itself is irrelevant. In this vision, the universe is not a battlefield between good and evil, but an extension of blind and indifferent forces. A creature that encompasses galaxies and exists beyond time does not torment out of cruelty, and does so in the same way that a forest fire consumes a forest, without thought, intention, or regret. When we face such beings, human morality seems ridiculously small, a fragile construction created by minds that confuse their own importance with universal truth. However, horror also questions human morality when faced with the supernatural. If a supernatural entity threatens civilization, does anything justify human cruelty as a response? Would it be acceptable to torture an innocent person if that prevented the emergence of an ancient god? In supernatural horror, ethics are tested by the magnitude of terror. If an evil force is beyond redemption, does that mean any action to stop it is justified? Or does the will to embrace cruelty reveal that the true horror was always human nature? Some horror narratives propose a different answer. Not that supernatural entities are beyond morality, but that morality is an illusion. If ghosts exist, then there is an afterlife. If demons exist, then divine judgment could exist. If the supernatural is real, then human ethics might not be based on reason or empathy, but on a cosmic hierarchy. What we call good and evil might not be decisions, but mere positions in an order beyond our understanding. A demon might not be choosing evil, just as gravity does not choose to pull objects down. But what if horror is not an external force, but an internal one? A possessed human, a corrupt soul, a person transformed into something inhuman. At what point does a being lose moral responsibility? If a supernatural force annuls free will, is the concept of evil still valid when a person becomes a receptacle of something older, darker, and more powerful than themselves? Is she still herself? The ethics of supernatural terror crosses the limits of human moral frameworks and forces us to question whether good and evil are fundamental truths or just rules we invented to navigate a world we believed was rational. If there are creatures that do not think, feel, or suffer like us, can we judge them according to human standards, or are we trapped in an illusion that confuses our ethical constructs with universal laws? Horror has always been more than fear. It is a test of our assumptions about reality, morality, and what it means to be human. But when we face the supernatural, the real terror might not be the creatures that lurk in the darkness. The real terror might be the possibility that morality itself has never been as solid as we thought. Dark utilitarianism. A man stands on the edge of a burning city, watching thousands of people perish in the flames. He has no doubt. He knows that their suffering is justified because beyond the rubble a better future awaits them. The calculations have been made, the cost has been weighed, and the sacrifice has been considered necessary. This is dark utilitarianism, the cold and brutal logic of maximizing well-being at any cost. If traditional utilitarianism seeks the greatest good for the greatest number, its darker counterpart asks what would happen if achieving that good required suffering on an unimaginable scale. In essence, utilitarianism is simple. Morality must be based on consequences, not intention. If an action increases happiness or reduces suffering, it is good. If it does the opposite, it is bad. But what happens when these calculations lead to horrible conclusions? What if the only way to maximize happiness is to break all ethical boundaries, to embrace cruelty in service to a distant utopia? The end justifies the means, but what happens when the means become monstrous? Dark utilitarianism is utilitarianism stripped of all feeling, reduced to pure arithmetic. If a life must be sacrificed to save 10, it is a fair exchange. If 1,000,000 must die to guarantee a golden age for 10 billion, it is not a tragedy, it is a necessity. In this framework, morality is no longer about goodness, justice, or dignity, but about pure efficiency. Suffering becomes a resource, pain a bargaining chip, and cruelty a tool. The question is no longer whether an action is good or bad, but whether it works. The idea lurks beneath the darkest moments of history. The justified conquest of empires in the name of progress. Leaders waged brutal wars, claiming that the suffering of the present would build a better future. Entire generations were sacrificed for ideologies that promised utopia. The logic is ruthless. If a few must endure agony so that countless others can prosper, shouldn't we accept suffering as part of the plan? And if suffering is inevitable, shouldn't we manage it with precision instead of letting it unfold chaotically? The implications go beyond the political and delve into the deeply personal. Imagine a world in which artificial intelligence, cold and calculating, determines the optimal way to structure society. If forced labor produces a stable and prosperous civilization, wouldn't it be justified to eliminate certain individuals if that maximizes the well-being of the rest? If a machine could simulate infinite torture for a single consciousness in exchange for erasing all suffering from reality, would that be the moral choice? Some might argue that dark utilitarianism is a corruption of utilitarian thought, an ethical failure disguised as pragmatism. Traditional utilitarians emphasize compassion, cooperation, and the reduction of suffering for all, but dark utilitarianism reveals the uncomfortable truth that lies at its foundation. If morality is just a numbers game, then ethics can become terribly mechanical. This forces us to ask a question that we rarely ask ourselves. Do we value morality because it is right, or because we want it to be right? If we eliminate emotion, empathy, and human feelings, does morality still exist, or does it dissolve into nothing more than a series of calculations? And if the numbers lead us to horrible conclusions, do we reject them or accept them? Do we follow them to the abyss? Perhaps the darkest revelation of all is that there is no external force to answer these questions for us. No cosmic judge, no universal law, no divine principle. Only choices. And in the absence of clear moral rules, we are left with a simple and chilling dilemma. If suffering is the price of utopia, do we dare pay it? Terror management theory. A figure stands in the darkness looking into the abyss of his own mortality. Each breath is a countdown, each moment a step closer to death. This is not paranoia. It is not a defect of human psychology. It is the fundamental truth that haunts every conscious being. One day you will die, and yet you do not spend every moment of your life terrified. You do not collapse under the weight of inevitable non-existence. You move on. You live your life. You make plans for a future that you know will eventually disappear. But how? This is the paradox that is found in the heart of the terror management theory. The idea that a large part of human behavior, culture, and belief systems exist to protect us from the crushing awareness of our own mortality. The theory proposes that, deep down, we all know a truth. Our lives are ephemeral, and the universe is indifferent to our existence. But to function and avoid paralysis by fear, we build elaborate psychological defenses that turn terror into meaning and anxiety into purpose. The fear of death does not disappear. It is managed from the moment we become aware of death and begin to build barriers against it. Religion promises a continuation beyond the void in the afterlife. Cultural values offer a sense of permanence, a way to be remembered. Even mundane actions, ambition, the accumulation of wealth, artistic expression, become desperate attempts to leave a mark, to defy the finality of death in any way we can. We tell ourselves that we matter, that our lives have meaning, that we are more than simple temporary collections of atoms destined to disperse. But these defenses are fragile when threatened. The terror resurfaces. That is why people react so violently when their belief systems are challenged, because under each ideology, each moral code, each vision of the world, there is a hidden foundation. The promise that life is not meaningless, that death is not the end. Anything that threatens this foundation is not just an attack on an idea, but an existential threat. That is why people cling to their beliefs with desperate fervor, not out of pure conviction, but because the alternative is unthinkable. The effects of terror management theory are everywhere. Political and religious extremism often arises from a deep need for certainty, a way to suppress the fear of death by linking one's identity to something eternal. Acts of heroism and sacrifice are driven in part by the desire to be remembered, to escape insignificance. Even the pursuit of beauty and pleasure can be seen as a challenge to mortality, a way to momentarily forget that time is running out. But what happens when the illusion breaks, when the awareness of death is no longer something that can be ignored? Some people embrace hedonism, seeking distraction and pleasure, while others fall into nihilism, overwhelmed by the understanding that everything is temporary, and some try to rewrite the rules completely, building new philosophies to live by, systems that do not deny death, but face it directly. However, the real terror of terror management theory is that no answer suffices. No amount of wealth, achievements, or beliefs can change the final outcome. The best we can do is manage fear, contain it, shape it so that it allows us to move forward, but beneath it all, the truth remains, the abyss awaits. The only question is, how long can we continue to look the other way? The banality of evil, a man sitting at a desk, shuffling papers, stamping forms, following orders. He does not see himself as a villain. He is not dominated by rage or hatred. He is simply doing his job. However, unimaginable suffering unfolds through his hands. It is not about a monster in the shadows, nor about a tyrant who orchestrates chaos with deliberate malice. It is about something more disturbing, a person who does not consider himself evil at all. It is about the banality of evil, a term coined by the political theorist Hannah Arendt when observing the trial of Adolf Eichmann, one of the main architects of the Holocaust. Eichmann was not a sadistic genius of evil, nor a man who enjoyed cruelty. He was an efficient bureaucrat, an official who followed orders, a man who saw himself as a simple cog in the machine. When he was confronted with the enormity of his acts, he did not feel rage or gloat, but insisted that he was only fulfilling his duty. This idea shattered the traditional image of evil that we like to imagine, in which villains are monstrous figures, people who are fundamentally evil. To the villains as monstrous figures, people fundamentally different from us, driven by personal malice or a deep and conscious hatred. But Arendt's vision was that evil does not always require a great ideology or a twisted ambition. Sometimes it only requires obedience. Sometimes the worst atrocities do not happen because people want to commit them, but because they do not question what they are told. It is a disturbing conclusion, if it can be so mundane, so ordinary. So, what prevents anyone from becoming an accomplice? History is full of moments in which people justified their actions by saying that they were following orders, that they were fulfilling their role, that they were not getting into trouble. The machinery of oppression, of genocide, of systematic cruelty is often not handled by obvious villains, but by people who consider themselves neutral, who disengage from responsibility. However, the banality of evil does not mean that evil is excusable. Quite the opposite. It reveals that the most terrifying acts in history are not driven by monstrous individuals, but by a system of passive conformity. It forces us to ask ourselves how many atrocities have been committed by people who thought they were only doing their job, how much suffering has been caused by those who decided not to think critically, not to resist, not to act. The most disturbing thing is that this is not just history. It is a pattern that continues to emerge in new forms every time people give up their moral judgment to authority, every time cruelty becomes routine, every time individuals absolve themselves of responsibility because they are simply following orders. The banality of evil resurfaces. It is a reminder that great horrors do not always begin with fanatics or tyrants, but often begin with silent obedience, and the line between observer and participant, between innocence and complicity, is much thinner than we would like to believe. The paradox of the hidden divine. A person kneels in the darkness and whispers into the void, asking for a sign, a voice, a whisper, anything that confirms that someone is listening, but the silence spreads vast and indifferent. If a divine being exists, why does it remain hidden? Why does it allow suffering, doubt, and disbelief to persist? If God is real, why does he not make his presence undeniable? This is the paradox of divine concealment, a problem that has tormented theologians and philosophers for centuries. It is not only a question of faith, but of logic. If an all-powerful, omniscient, and perfectly loving deity exists, then surely that being would want humans to know they are not alone. Without a doubt, clarity is preferable to uncertainty. And nevertheless, however many prayers are sent to the ether, however much suffering unfolds, the divine remains silent. Some argue that God's concealment is a test, a way to separate the faithful from the skeptics. But why would a loving deity make belief so difficult if the consequences of disbelief are eternal separation or punishment? Wouldn't it be more just, more merciful, to reveal divine truth beyond all doubt if human souls are at stake? Why play such a dangerous game? Others suggest that faith must be voluntary, that belief without proof has more meaning, but this explanation falters when compared to how humans navigate the world. We do not consider knowledge of gravity or the existence of the sun something that annuls free will. Why should the divine presence be different? Some theists propose that God does reveal himself, but in a subtle way, through personal experiences, nature, or morality itself. However, these revelations are inconsistent, ambiguous, and often indistinguishable from coincidence. Why would a divine being communicate in riddles, leaving room for doubt instead of presenting irrefutable evidence? If a father hides from his children and only offers cryptic clues instead of being present, will we call it love or negligence? Then there's the possibility that the divine concealment is not a mystery at all, that the reason why we do not hear a voice from the heavens, the reason why no irrefutable miracle occurs, is that there's nothing there to be revealed. That silence is not an enigma, but an answer. However, even for those who reject the idea of God, the paradox is still present. Human beings seem programmed to seek meaning, to yearn for a higher presence, to wonder why we exist. Whether one believes in a divine being or not, the absence of an answer to these questions is disturbing. The world remains silent, indifferent to prayers, impassive to suffering. Perhaps the paradox of divine concealment is not a challenge to faith, but a confrontation with uncertainty itself. It forces us to ask ourselves if meaning must be given or if it must be created, if silence is an absence or an invitation, if we must continue listening or learn to speak ourselves to make sense of the void, to invert solipsism. You enter a room feeling the weight of existence pressing on you. But as you look around, you are invaded by a disturbing thought. What if you are not the only conscious being? What if instead of being the only mind in a world of illusions, you are the illusion? This is reverse solipsism, the disturbing inversion of the classic solipsistic dilemma. Traditional solipsism postulates that only the self is real, that everything outside of one's own consciousness may be an elaborate construction of the mind. But reverse solipsism turns the perspective around. What if you are the construction, an ephemeral thought floating in a world full of real conscious beings? What if the world exists independently of you, but you yourself are a mere product of imagination, a transient whisper in the minds of others? Think about your memories. How do you know that they are really yours and not implanted echoes of a story that was never lived? Your thoughts seem personal, but what if they are nothing more than the will of another? Perhaps you were created to fulfill a function, to populate a world that was never intended for you. Perhaps the reason why the universe seems so vast, so unknown, is that it was never built for you to understand. Even if the world is real and everyone else is truly conscious, the question remains, are you? What if your inner monologue, your sense of self, is nothing more than an intricate process without origin, a vessel through which experience flows, but to which it never really belongs? You assume you have free will, but what if you're just reacting? You assume you're thinking, but what if you were just following a script? Reverse solipsism shakes the foundations of personal identity. It forces you to question not whether the world is real, but whether you are in a universe full of autonomous minds. What if yours is the only one that doesn't really exist? And if you're not the thinker, but the thought, then who, if anyone, is thinking? The hedonistic hamster wheel. You pursue pleasure believing that just a little more will finally bring you lasting happiness, a better job, a bigger house, an exciting experience. Surely once you have that, the void will disappear, but when you get what you want, the satisfaction fades, the excitement fades, and the cycle begins again. This is the hedonistic hamster wheel, a psychological paradox in which, no matter how much pleasure we accumulate, we always return to a starting point of satisfaction or dissatisfaction. At first, the pattern is easy to dismiss. You tell yourself that you simply need more wealth, more love, more prestige. But the problem is not just the amount of pleasure, it is the very nature of human psychology. Our brains are programmed to adapt. The moment something pleasurable becomes familiar, it ceases to be pleasurable. In the same way, what was once exciting becomes routine. What was once a dream come true becomes the new normal. The happiness you thought was permanent evaporates like mist in the sun. The wheel analogy is accurate. You run faster, you push harder, you achieve more, but you remain in the same place emotionally. The external circumstances of your life may change drastically, but internally your level of happiness remains stubbornly constant. Studies show that even after major life events, such as winning the lottery or suffering a debilitating injury, people tend to return to their previous level of happiness within months or years. The mind resets and recalibrates to the new circumstances, but not in the way we expect. Extreme ups and downs are temporary. The baseline always reasserts itself. Philosophers have grappled with this problem for centuries. The ancient Stoics warned against the pursuit of pleasure, recognizing its impermanence, and advised cultivating apathy, an emotional balance immune to the ups and downs of fortune. For their part, Buddhists diagnosed the same problem in different terms, calling it dukkha, the suffering that arises from attachment. They argued that desire itself is the root of suffering, because all pleasures are transient. The moment we crave more, we suffer. But modern psychology not only confirms this ancient wisdom, but also quantifies it. The phenomenon has its origin in hedonic adaptation, the tendency of the brain to diminish the impact of stimuli, both positive and negative, over time. The first bite of cake is a delight, the third is simply pleasant, and the 10th is almost pointless. The same goes for wealth, relationships, and even life-changing achievements. The moment you normalize pleasure, it ceases to be pleasure. This raises a disturbing question. If lasting happiness is not found in external rewards, where does it come from? Some suggest shifting the focus from fleeting pleasures to intrinsic satisfaction, such as personal growth, deep relationships, or purposeful work. Others argue that the only way to get out of the routine is to stop running completely, to reject the modern compulsion to pursue happiness as a prize that can be won. But what if there is no way out? What if the routine is not a defect of the human condition, but its defining characteristic? The mind may not be designed for lasting satisfaction, that perhaps we're never destined to achieve happiness, but only to pursue it endlessly. If pleasure fades by design, then perhaps the mere act of striving, however futile, is what keeps us moving. The hypothesis of the perennial lobotomy beneath the surface of human civilization hides a disturbing possibility. What if progress is not the triumph of intelligence, but its slow surgical extirpation? What if the more complex our societies become, the more we collectively dull the sharp edges of human thought, like a patient tied to a chair undergoing lobotomy, without even realizing what is happening? This is the core of the perennial lobotomy hypothesis, the idea that as civilization advances, the full potential of human cognition is systematically suppressed, not out of malice, but as an inevitable consequence of stability, order, and control. To understand it, let's think about the fundamental tension between intelligence and survival. Human beings are thinking creatures, but deep thought, which questions everything, resists conformity, and rejects established narratives, is often disruptive. A society that thrives on stability cannot afford to have too many people relentlessly questioning its foundations throughout history. The most structured civilizations have not only rewarded compliance, but subtly reconfigured the way people think. Education is standardized, work is specialized, distractions multiply, and critical thinking is channeled into safe, manageable outlets. The result is a world in which intelligence is tolerated, even celebrated, in controlled environments, but discouraged when it threatens the systems that sustain it. The hypothesis takes its name from the infamous medical procedure, lobotomy, a crude but effective way to pacify individuals considered too rebellious, anxious, or resistant to authority. But, unlike surgical lobotomy, this process is not carried out with scalpels and electrodes, but occurs gradually over generations through cultural norms, institutional structures, and the very design of modern life. It is a lobotomy not of the individual, but of the species itself, repeated throughout history, refining its methods in each iteration until the very idea of questioning the process seems unnatural. Technology, which once promised to expand human knowledge, has become one of the main tools of this anesthesia. An endless stream of entertainment algorithmically curated to maintain interest without fostering independent thought, which keeps the mind busy but stagnant. Information is abundant, but so overwhelming that authentic intellectual advances are drowned out by the noise. The very tools that should elevate human reasoning ensure that most people never have to think too much about anything. Not even philosophical and intellectual traditions are immune. Many of history's most disruptive thinkers, those who dared to pull back the curtain, were ignored, silenced, or absorbed into the system in such a way that their radical ideas seemed safe, sanitized. The revolutionary becomes a symbol rather than a threat. His words are quoted, his images are printed on posters, but his most dangerous ideas are archived where they can no longer do harm. Some argue that this is not a defect, but a necessary function of civilization. Too much unfiltered intelligence, too many questions, too much raw intellectual freedom could lead to chaos. Stability requires predictability, and predictability thrives in minds that accept their place in the great design without resistance. It is easier to move forward as a species when the vast majority of people are content not to wonder where they are going. But what if this comes at a cost? What if, by choosing order over untamed thought, humanity has gradually lobotomized itself, sacrificing its full intellectual and philosophical potential for comfort? With the great minds of the past, Socrates, Nietzsche, Lenin, see us as wiser than before, or simply more domesticated. The perennial lobotomy hypothesis does not claim that intelligence has disappeared. It still exists, but in a controlled and managed form. Brilliant minds guided towards problems that reinforce the system rather than challenge it. The true dangers of thought, the questions that could shake the foundations of civilization, remain locked away. The true lobotomy is not the absence of intelligence, but the absence of a world in which it is allowed to fully develop. So the question remains, is this the price of progress, or simply the mechanism by which humanity ensures that it will never truly awaken? Metaphysical loneliness. There's a silence deeper than the absence of sound, a loneliness deeper than isolation. It is not the loneliness of not being heard or seen, but the loneliness of knowing that no one, not a friend, not a lover, not even the universe itself, can truly reach you. This is metaphysical loneliness, the inescapable distance between the self and reality, a fracture so fundamental that it calls into question the very nature of connection, understanding, and existence. At first glance, the world seems rich in relationships, in shared emotions and experiences. People talk, laugh, love, and suffer together. But beneath this illusion of connection lies a disturbing reality. Everything you experience is filtered through the limits of your own mind. No one else sees through your eyes. No one else feels your pain exactly as you do. Your conscience is a sealed chamber, isolated from other minds by walls of subjective perception. The problem runs deeper than a simple misunderstanding. Even if two people share a moment, even if they claim to feel the same, their experiences are not truly identical, only parallel, like reflections in separate mirrors. When you say you feel joy, sorrow, or fear, how can you know that what another person calls by the same name is truly equal to what you feel? You cannot enter their mind. You cannot bridge the distance between your world and theirs. This loneliness is not merely emotional or intellectual. It is metaphysical. It is embedded in the very structure of consciousness. As much as you express yourself, as deeply as you connect with others, you are still an island of perception in a sea of unknown minds. Some philosophers have framed this as the ultimate existential barrier. We are born alone, we think alone, and we die alone, eternally imprisoned within the limits of our own consciousness. However, the most disturbing aspect of metaphysical loneliness is not simply that others are unknowable, but that reality itself may be. Each interaction, each sensation, each thought is mediated by the brain, which means that what you consider the external world is nothing more than a processed image, a reconstruction inside your skull. You never perceive reality directly, only the interpretation that your mind provides. If that is true, then even the universe, the very thing in which you exist, may be another entity you never reach. Some are comforted by the idea that, despite this loneliness, human beings still strive to connect, form relationships, create art, tell stories, all in an attempt to narrow the gap, to make themselves understood, even if imperfectly. But others see this as nothing more than a beautiful illusion, a desperate attempt to escape a truth too unbearable to fully acknowledge. That, in the end, no matter how much you try to share your mind, your thoughts remain only yours, locked away, beyond translation. So, what remains is metaphysical loneliness, a tragedy, or is it simply the price of having a mind, of being conscious, of being separate, of existing, of being alone? But if this loneliness is inescapable, perhaps the question is not how to bridge the gap, but how to make sense of it. The cosmic prison hypothesis. The universe seems vast, beyond comprehension, an infinite expanse of galaxies, stars, and unknown worlds that stretches in all directions, seemingly limitless, impossibly large. And yet, what if this immensity is not freedom, but confinement? What if the cosmos is not an open expanse, but a carefully constructed prison, so immense and so perfectly designed that its captives do not even realize they are trapped? This is the cosmic prison hypothesis, the disturbing idea that we do not simply exist within the universe, but that we are bound to it in ways that we cannot perceive or escape. In essence, this hypothesis questions the nature of our reality. Are we truly free within the cosmos, or are we mere prisoners without awareness of our limitations? The idea is not new throughout history. Various cultures and philosophies have contemplated the idea that existence itself could be a form of captivity. The ancient Gnostics, for example, believed that the material world was a deception, a prison built by an imperfect or malevolent creator to prevent souls from escaping to a higher reality. In more modern terms, theories of simulation, cosmic determinism, and existential entrapment suggest that reality itself could be structured to keep its inhabitants confined. But confined by whom, and for what purpose? One version of the hypothesis suggests that the universe itself operates under strict physical laws that act as its walls and bars. No matter how much we learn, no matter how much we expand the limits of science and exploration, we're still bound by forces that we do not choose and that we cannot override. We cannot exceed the speed of light. We cannot escape entropy. We cannot exist outside time. Each discovery only reinforces the idea that the universe operates under fixed rules, as if it were designed to ensure that no being within it ever finds a way to get out. Some theories go further and suggest that intelligence itself is part of the confinement, that our thoughts, emotions, and even the very structure of consciousness may be limitations imposed on us. Why do we yearn for meaning in a universe that offers none? Why does time only move forward, pushing us toward decay and death? Why do we have the ability to ask these questions, but never the means to answer them? If the cosmos is a prison, then perhaps the greatest cruelty is that its inmates are aware enough to perceive their confinement, but never able to escape it. Could there be a jailer? This is where the hypothesis takes its darkest turn. Some interpretations suggest that if the universe is a prison, then it must serve a purpose. It may be that sentient life is not meant to explore, but to be contained, whether for observation, punishment, or some unknown purpose. Perhaps we are part of an experiment. Our struggles and achievements are nothing more than data being collected. Or perhaps, as some religious and philosophical traditions have proposed, we are beings trapped in a cycle of existence, held here until some condition is met, some lesson is learned, or some invisible debt is paid. And yet, if this is a prison, where is the door? Could the rules of the universe be broken? If the fundamental nature of reality is a form of containment, then perhaps the only way to escape is to overcome the limits of one's own perception. Some speculate that enlightenment, transcendence, or technological singularity could reveal a way out, an understanding so complete that the illusion of imprisonment is shattered. But if the prison is perfect, then any path to freedom would be nothing more than another layer of the illusion, another cell disguised as an open door. In the end, the cosmic prison hypothesis forces us to consider the possibility that the immensity that amazes us is not liberation, but a labyrinth without center or edge, a cage so immense that its walls are invisible, so absolute that it is not even conceivable to escape. But if that is true, then perhaps the only thing left to do is what all prisoners do. Look for cracks in the walls, test the limits of the cage, and always question, whether the bars are real or whether we have simply imagined them. The more we delve into the depths of philosophy, the more disturbing the questions become. We have wandered through paradoxes, we have contemplated existential voids, and we have faced ideas that challenge the very foundations of reality. But these theories do not offer easy answers, only more questions, and perhaps it is all there is, perhaps the search itself is all that we have. If you have come this far, consider leaving a comment. Which of these theories has disturbed you the most, or is there one that we have not dealt with and that is still on your mind? Your thoughts may give rise to the next debate. And if you want more trips to the strangest corners of philosophy, science, and existence, remember to click like, subscribe, and activate notifications. There's always another question waiting to be asked.